Galactic empires across the cosmos shit their alien pants as Earth's ancient Dreadnought fleet, long thought lost, dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the Milky Way. Brian Brown, ex-military pilot turned smuggler, cursed as his starship bucked wildly, caught in the tractor beam of a Barzan patrol cruiser. The grizzled veteran had been running contraband through the Zeta Reticuli system, hoping to score a big payday. But now he was royally fucked. Shit, Brian muttered, slamming a fist on the control console. Red warning lights flashed across the cockpit as the cruiser reeled him in. He reached for his blaster, checking the charge. It was nearly drained. The ship lurched as it set down in the cruiser's hangar bay. Brian tensed, finger on the trigger. The airlock hissed open. Boots thudded on metal. A squad of Barzan troopers stormed in, pulse rifles leveled at Brian's head. Their reptilian eyes gleamed coldly beneath their helmets. A tall Barzan officer strode forward, his uniform crisp and gray. Commander Tyro. Well, what do we have here? Tyro asked, mandibles clicking. He scanned the cargo hold packed with crates of illegal weapons and stims. Quite the haul, smuggler. You're in deep trouble. Brian forced a grin. Tyro, buddy, this is all just a misunderstanding. How about we crack open a bottle of Rigelian whiskey and talk this out? Can it, punk? Tyro snapped. He motioned to the troopers. Cuff him and toss him in the brig. We'll let the magistrate sort him out. Brian tensed as the troopers advanced, preparing to fight. But suddenly an urgent message blared over the ship's comms. Tyro froze, listening. Commander, we have an emergency. A massive Kralian warship just dropped out of warp and is attacking our outpost in Sector 9. They're slaughtering our people. Damn it, Tyro growled. He turned to Brian. You got lucky, you piece of shit. We've got bigger problems now. He motioned to the troopers. They lowered their rifles. Here's the deal. You help us fight those Kralian bugs, and maybe we forget about your smuggling operation. We need all the pilots we can get, but if you try anything, I'll blast you out the airlock myself. Got it? Brian nodded quickly. You got it, boss. Let's go squash some bugs. As Tyro led Brian to the armory, the human couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. This was a chance to put his skills to the test, to make a difference. But he also knew the stakes. The Kralians were a vicious, relentless foe, powerful and cruel. If the Barzan fell, they would rampage across the galaxy, enslaving and slaughtering any who stood in their way, including humanity. Like it or not, Brian realized, he was a key player in this conflict now. The fate of the galaxy might just rest in one grizzled human smuggler's hands. It was a crazy thought. But hey, that's why he'd become a smuggler in the first place. For the thrills, the adventure. Looks like he was about to get one hell of a ride. Brian and Tyro raced back to their fighters, blasting off from the hangar bay. As they tore through space towards the Barzan outpost, the comms crackled with panicked chatter. Kralian drones swarmed the outpost, strafing it with plasma fire. This doesn't make sense, Brian muttered, juking his fighter to avoid a drone's shots. The Kralians have the firepower to wipe out that outpost. Why send in drones? It's a diversion, Tyro growled. His fighter flipped and spun, blasting drones to scrap. They're after something else. Brian's console pinged with an alert. Long-range scanners had picked up a Kralian strike team, heading away from the battle, towards the Oort cloud. The research station, Tyro said grimly. They're going for the weapon. Brian's mind raced. The outpost was getting torn to shreds, but if the Kralians got their claws on that weapon, they could destabilize entire star systems, wipe out whole planets. Tyro, we have to go after that strike team, Brian urged. Forget the outpost. If the Kralians get that weapon, it's game over. Tyro hesitated, his loyalty to his troops warring with the greater threat. Finally, he snarled in frustration. Damn it, you're right! All fighters, pursue the Kralian strike team! Now! They rocketed into the Oort cloud, a treacherous field of ice and rock. Brian gritted his teeth as he wove through the debris, the strike team's ion trail guiding them forward. The research station loomed ahead, a gleaming spire amidst the frozen waste. Kralian ships swarmed it like locusts, spewing plasma at its shields. "We're too late," Tyro said. "They've already breached the outer defenses." "Then we'll have to take the fight inside," Brian replied. "Let's land in that hangar bay and fight our way to the vault." They set down and charged out, blasters blazing. Kralian soldiers, hulking brutes in spiked armor, met them with a hail of razor shards. Brian and Tyro took cover, trading shots. They fought their way through the corridors, stepping over Barzan and Kralian corpses. The air stank of ozone and iron. A door hissed open and a Barzan female stumbled out, her lab coat singed and torn. "Don't shoot!" she cried, raising her hands. "I'm Dr. Zara, the lead scientist." "Where's the weapon?" Tyro demanded, keeping his blaster trained on her. "The vault," Zara said, her voice shaking. "But you don't understand. It's not just a prototype, it's a relic from an ancient civilization that ruled the galaxy eons ago." Brian frowned. "What does that have to do with the Kralians?" "They're not in charge," Zara whispered. "They serve the Ascended, a race of energy beings. The Ascended want the relic back. They mean to reclaim their lost empire and dominate the younger races." Brian and Tyro traded glances. This was bigger than they could have imagined. Now they had to keep the weapon out of the hands of the Kralians and these Ascended. As they raced towards the vault, Brian's mind spun with the implications. The profit from securing the relic could set him up for life, but if it fell into the wrong hands, it could mean the end of everything. He'd started this day as a simple smuggler. Now he realized, with growing unease, the fate of the galaxy might just rest on the choices he made in the next few minutes. Brian cursed under his breath as the sound of Kralian boots echoed through the corridors. He turned to Tyro and Zara, his eyes hard. "We need to move now. I'll create a diversion, draw them away from the lab. You two get that weapon ready for transport." Tyro nodded, his mandibles clicking. "You sure you can handle them alone, human?" Brian grinned, though there was little humor in it. "I've been in tighter spots. Just get it done." He ducked out of the lab, his blaster at the ready. He moved through the facility, planting explosives at key points. As the charges detonated, alarms blared and Kralian soldiers shouted in confusion. Brian wove through the chaos, engaging the Kralians in brief, brutal firefights. He used every trick he knew, every dirty tactic he'd learned in the smuggling trade, to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. In the lab, Tyro and Zara worked frantically to stabilize the ancient weapon. Zara's hands flew over the controls, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This weapon," she said, her voice tight, "it was part of a network. The Ascended used them to maintain their control over the galaxy. If they get their hands on this—" Tyro growled, "They won't. We'll make sure of it." Just as they finished prepping the weapon for transport, the lab door exploded inward. Kralian soldiers poured in, their shards flying. Tyro leapt to meet them, his blaster spitting fire. He fought like a demon, taking down Kralian after Kralian, but there were too many. A shard caught him in the side, and he went down, green blood pooling beneath him. Brian burst into the lab, his blaster blazing. He cut down the remaining Kralians, then rushed to help Zara load Tyro and the weapon onto the transport pod. They blasted out of the facility, the pod shaking as the Kralians opened fire. Brian gritted his teeth, weaving through the icy debris of the Ort cloud. As they fled, a realization hit him. The weapon wasn't safe, not anywhere in the known galaxy, except maybe for one place. "Earth," he said. "We need to take it to Earth. The Ascended and their goons won't think to look there." Tyro, his breathing labored, met Brian's gaze. "You may be right, human. I never thought I'd say this, but I'll help you get there." And so, they set course for Earth, the ancient weapon humming ominously in the hold. Brian knew this was just the beginning. The Ascended, the Kralians, they wouldn't give up easily. But he was a smuggler, a survivor. He'd beaten the odds before, and with Tyro and Zara at his side, maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance. The stars streaked past as they hurtled through the void, the first leg in a desperate journey to save the galaxy from the sins of its ancient past. The stars streaked past the viewports as the Icarus limped through the void, her hull scorched and pitted from the skirmish with the Kralian scouts. Brian gripped the controls, his jaw clenched as he fought to keep the ship steady. Tyro hunched over the navigation console, searching for a safe harbor. "There," Tyro said, pointing to a blinking light on the star map. "The Riben Bazaar. It's a hive of scum and villainy, but we should be able to lay low and make repairs." Brian nodded, adjusting course. The Icarus shuddered as she dropped out of hyperspace, the sprawling space station looming before them like a rusted metal spider suspended in the void. They docked at a grimy airlock, the ancient weapon secured in a hidden compartment. Tyro and Zara stayed aboard to work on the engines, while Brian ventured out into the bazaar to gather supplies and information. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and spice as Brian pushed through the crowds of aliens and humans. He kept a hand on his blaster, eyes darting warily. This was the kind of place where a man could lose his wallet or his life in a heartbeat. "Well, well, look what the void dragged in," a familiar voice drawled. Brian spun, coming face to face with a lean, scruffy-looking human leaning against a market stall. "Lex, is that you, you old bastard?" Lex grinned, his teeth flashing white in his tanned face. "In the flesh, although I go by Cypher these days. Got a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Brian clasped his old friend's hand, grinning despite himself. "What are you doing in this dump?" Lex's smile faded. He glanced around, then leaned in close. "Word is, you and your little crew have gotten yourselves in deep with the Ascended. They've put a bounty on your heads that would make a Hutt blush." Brian's blood ran cold. "How do you know about that?" "I hear things," Lex said with a shrug. "The Ascended have been pulling strings in this galaxy for a long time, longer than anyone realizes. They've orchestrated wars, toppled governments, all to keep us divided and weak." Brian's mind raced. If what Lex said was true, then the Ascended were an even greater threat than he'd imagined. "We could use your help, Lex. We need to gather supplies and intel, figure out our next move." Lex's eyes narrowed. "And what's in it for me?" "A cut of whatever valuable information we uncover about the Ascended," Brian said. "Trust me, if we play this right, we could be set for life." Lex considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'm in. But we better watch our backs. This station is crawling with mercs and bounty hunters who would sell their own mothers for a shot at that price on your head." They set off into the bazaar, Lex leading the way through the twisting alleys and crowded market squares. They were just haggling over a crate of power cells when a blaster bolt sizzled past Brian's ear. He dove for cover, Lex right beside him. A group of heavily armed Kralians advanced on their position, razor shards peppering the market stall. Brian and Lex returned fire, their blasters spitting red bolts, the air filled with the stench of ozone and charred flesh as they cut down the assassins one by one. But more kept coming, pouring out of the alleys like roaches. Brian's heart pounded as he realized they were being overrun. "We need to get back to the ship." They fought their way through the bazaar, dodging blaster fire and leaping over fallen bodies. By the time they reached the airlock, they were both bleeding from a dozen minor wounds. Tyro had the engines humming as they blasted away from the station. But as they made the jump to hyperspace, Zara emerged from the back, her face pale. "I've been studying the weapon," she said, her voice shaking, "and I don't think it's just a weapon. I think it's a key." "A key to what?" Brian asked, a sinking feeling in his gut. "To everything," Zara whispered. "A network of ancient technologies scattered across the galaxy. Weapons, transportation systems, maybe even the ability to alter reality itself. If the Ascended get their hands on all of it." She trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. They all knew what it would mean. The end of free will, the end of everything. Brian met Tyro's gaze, seeing his own grim determination reflected back at him. They had no choice now. They had to get to Earth, had to keep this weapon and the secrets it held out of the Ascended's grasp. No matter the cost. The Icarus shuddered violently, sparks flying from overloaded consoles as the ship was rocked by a massive shockwave. Brian gripped the controls, fighting to stabilize their trajectory. "Report!" he barked. Zara's eyes were wide as she scanned the sensor readings. "We've been pulled out of hyperspace. There's a massive battle raging all around us." Brian stared out the viewport in disbelief. Countless ships clashed against the starry backdrop, energy weapons flashing like lightning, and amidst the chaos, a fleet of sleek, angular vessels unlike any he'd seen before. "The energy signatures," Zara said, her voice trembling. "They match the weapon we're carrying." Brian's mind raced. The Ascended. These ships were part of their lost armada, awakened after eons of slumber. He turned to Tyro and Zara, a reckless plan forming. "We need intel on these Ascended ships. I say we use the battle as cover, slip aboard one and raid its database." Tyro's mandibles clicked skeptically. "A foolish risk." "But worth it," Brian pressed. "That data could give us the edge we need." Tyro hesitated, then nodded grimly. "Very well, but we move quickly and carefully." They donned matte black stealth suits, double-checking their weapons and gear. With a final nod, Brian and Tyro cycled the airlock and launched into the void. They jetted through the heart of the battle, twisting and rolling to evade sizzling energy blasts and hurtling debris. Brian's heart pounded as they neared an Ascended ship, sleek and alien, its hull pulsing with eerie green light. They used mag grips to cling to the hull, scurrying toward what looked like an access port. Brian slapped a breaching charge on the airlock. With a muffled thump, the hatch blew open. They plunged into the ship, blasters raised. The interior was a nightmarish fusion of technology and something disturbingly organic. Veins of crackling energy pulsed through quivering, fleshy walls. Strange drones, all grasping tendrils and pulsing nodes, floated toward them, whirring menacingly. Brian and Tyro opened fire, their blasters searing through the biomechanical horrors. They fought their way deeper into the ship, following Zara's signal toward the data core. More drones swarmed to stop them, the ship's defenses growing more aggressive with each step. Finally, they burst into the data sanctum, a cavernous chamber thrumming with alien power. Tyro lunged to the central console, his claws flying over the holographic controls. "Cover me," he snapped as he began hacking the system. "This could take a while." Brian took up position at the entrance, his blaster spitting fire as more drones pressed the attack. The minutes crawled by, Tyro cursing as he battled the ship's firewalls. Suddenly, a deep, resonant thrum shook the chamber. The drones fell back, twitching spasmodically. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. "It's the ship's AI," Tyro said tightly. "It's waking up. We're out of time." "Do you have the data?" Brian demanded. "Most of it. We need to go now." They sprinted back the way they'd come, the ship shuddering and bucking around them. The walls rippled, the very ship seeming to come alive, raging at the intruders in its midst. Drones swarmed from every direction, a nightmarish tide of grasping metal and pulsing flesh. Brian and Tyro fought like cornered wolves, their blasters and blades flashing in the eerie light. They barely made it back to the airlock, sealing it shut behind them as clawed tendrils scraped at the metal. They launched away from the ship, racing desperately for the Icarus. Behind them, the Ascended ship convulsed, green fire erupting from rents in its hull. Brian realized with cold dread that it was self-destructing, denying its secrets to the enemy. They tumbled into the Icarus's airlock, gasping and shaking. As Zara pulled them away, the Ascended ship exploded in a blinding flash of emerald light. All around them, the Galactic Alliance ships pressed their sudden advantage, hammering the Ascended fleet with renewed fury. Faced with the shocking loss of one of their own, the Ascended ships fell back, vanishing into the depths of space as quickly as they had appeared. In the sudden stillness that followed, Brian, Tyro, and Zara looked at each other, the weight of what they'd just done sinking in. They had struck a blow against the Ascended, had seized a cache of precious data. But as they set course once more for Earth, the ancient weapon humming in the hold, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they had just kicked a hornet's nest. The Ascended would be coming for them now. And this time, they wouldn't underestimate the determination of one stubborn human and his ragtag crew. Zara hunched over the control console on the Icarus, her eyes flashing over the data they'd stolen from the Ascended ship. She tapped furiously at the holographic displays, lines of alien code flickering across the screens. Her brow furrowed as she dug deeper into the files. Suddenly she froze. "Oh no!" Brian glanced up from where he was cleaning his blaster. "What is it?" "This weapon isn't just a key," Zara said, her voice shaking. "It's a beacon. If activated, it will summon the entire Ascended fleet right to our location, right to Earth." Tyro's mandibles clicked in agitation. "Then we must destroy it immediately. We cannot allow such power to fall into their hands." But Brian shook his head, a glint in his eye. "No, this could be our chance. We could use it as a bargaining chip, force the Ascended to back off." Tyro slammed a clawed fist on the console. "Are you mad? We cannot negotiate with those abominations." The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring. Brian leapt to the controls, his fingers flying over the interface. "We're being boarded. Mercenaries looks like. Heavily armed." Zara's eyes widened in fear. "It's Zorn. The Ascended must have sent him to retrieve the weapon." Brian and Tyro shared a grim look. They grabbed their weapons and raced to the airlock, ready to repel the invaders. The airlock exploded inward, smoke and shrapnel filling the corridor. Armored figures poured through the breach, blasters spitting plasma. Brian and Tyro opened fire, the close quarters erupting into a fierce firefight. Brian ducked as a blaster bolt sizzled over his head. He popped up, drilling a merc through the faceplate. Beside him, Tyro fought with the ferocity of a cornered predator, his claws and blade ripping through armor and flesh. In the chaos, Lex charged forward, firing from the hip. A plasma bolt caught him in the chest, burning through his armor. He fell, blood pooling beneath him. "Lex!" Brian shouted, but there was no time to help his friend. More mercs were pouring in, threatening to overwhelm them. Brian gritted his teeth, making a split-second decision. "Tyro, take Lex and get to the shuttle. Get out of here." Tyro hesitated, torn between loyalty and duty. "What about you?" "Zara and I will draw their fire, protect the weapon. Now go, that's an order." Tyro snarled, but obeyed. He slung Lex over his shoulder and fought his way to the shuttle bay. Brian and Zara fell back, sealing the blast doors behind them. In the shuttle, Tyro laid Lex on a medical bunk, applying pressure to the wound. Lex groaned, his face pale. "Leave me. Get out while you can." Tyro shook his head. "I will not abandon you, human. You fought bravely. Now hold on." The shuttle blasted away from the Icarus, engines straining. Tyro watched the ship recede, his heart heavy. He hoped Brian and Zara would find a way out. On the Icarus, Brian and Zara sprinted through the corridors, the sound of booted feet close behind. They burst into the reactor chamber, sealing the door. Zara's hands flew over the controls. "I'm setting the reactor to overload. It should take out the ship and the weapon." Brian nodded, his face grim. "And Zorn with it. Let's just hope we can get clear in time." The door shuddered as the mercs tried to force it open. Brian and Zara took up positions, ready for a final stand. With a screech of tortured metal, the door gave way. Zorn strode through, a hulking figure in black armor, his face hidden behind a skull-like helmet. Mercs flanked him, weapons trained on Brian and Zara. "Hand over the weapon," Zorn rumbled, "and I may let you live." Brian smirked. "Come and get it, asshole." He opened fire, Zara joining in. Mercs fell, but Zorn charged forward, shrugging off the blasts. He backhanded Brian across the room, then grabbed Zara by the throat, lifting her off her feet. "Where is it?" he snarled. Zara choked, scrabbling at his armored gauntlet. Brian struggled to his feet, blood running down his face. He saw the weapon, lying just a few feet from Zorn. He lunged for it, scooping it up. Zorn tossed Zara aside, advancing on Brian. "Give it to me!" Brian grinned bloodily. You want it? Here. He hurled the weapon, not at Zorn, but at the overloading reactor. It struck with a flash, the ancient technology reacting violently with the modern power source. Zorn's eyes widened behind his helmet. He made a grab for the weapon, but it was too late. Brian grabbed Zara, dragging her towards the escape pods. They tumbled inside just as the reactor went critical. The Icarus exploded, a miniature sun blooming in the void. The shockwave caught the escape pod, sending it tumbling. Brian and Zara clung to each other as the pod righted itself, engines stabilizing. Zara wept softly, her face pressed against Brian's chest. It's gone. The weapon destroyed. Along with Zorn, Brian said grimly. But the cost... He thought of Lex, of the brave warrior left behind. Zara looked up at him, her eyes fierce through the tears. Their sacrifices won't be in vain. We'll finish this. Stop the Ascended. For them. Brian nodded, holding her close as the pod carried them away from the wreckage, towards an uncertain future. But one thing was certain. The fight was far from over. Zara drifted in the void, her escape pod tumbling end over end. Through the tiny viewport, the shattered remains of the Icarus glittered in the starlight. A silent tomb for Brian. Tears stung her eyes as grief tightened her throat. A shadow fell across the pod. The hull of a battered freighter filled the viewport, its cargo bay doors yawning open. A tractor beam caught the pod, drawing it into the ship's belly. The pod hatch hissed open. Zara blinked in the sudden light, squinting up at the grizzled human face peering down at her. You all right there, miss? Zara nodded, clambering out of the pod on shaking legs. Thank you, My friends, are they... Easy now, the freighter captain said, steadying her. We picked up another shuttle not long before you. They're in the med bay. Zara raced through the freighter's corridors, bursting into the med bay. Tyro and Lex lay on medical bunks, their wounds bandaged. They looked up as she entered, relief and sorrow warring on their faces. Brian? Tyro asked, though the hope in his voice was faint. Zara shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. He didn't make it. He sacrificed himself to destroy the weapon and kill Zorn. They sat in silence, the weight of their loss heavy in the air. Brian had been more than just their leader. He'd been their friend, their brother in arms. A chime from the comm panel broke the stillness. Zara frowned, tapping the screen. A text message scrolled across the display, the sender marked as unknown. If you want to know the truth about the Ascended, come to the coordinates below. Come alone. Tell no one. Zara's heart raced. Could it be a trap? But what choice did they have? Any lead, any scrap of information that could help them stop the Ascended was worth the risk. She showed the message to Tyro and Lex. They stared at the screen, brows furrowed. It could be a trick, Lex said, wincing as he sat up. The Ascended trying to lure us out. Or it could be our only chance, Tyro countered. We have to take it. Zara nodded. For Brian. For everyone the Ascended have hurt. We have to see this through. They set course for the coordinates, a remote, uninhabited world in the Orion sector. As the freighter dropped them at the edge of a vast, barren plain, Zara felt a chill run down her spine. Rising from the dust was a city, its towering spires gleaming beneath the alien sun. But there was something eerie about it, something unnatural in the too perfect symmetry of its architecture. They made their way into the silent streets, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the sandy ground. Elaborate friezes adorned the buildings, depicting strange, insectoid creatures locked in battle with armies of faceless humanoids. These carvings, Zara murmured, running her fingers over the intricate stonework. They're just like the ones we saw on the Ascended ships. Suddenly, the whine of pulse rifles powering up filled the air. Zara spun, her hand flying to her blaster. A dozen soldiers in unfamiliar black armor had emerged from the buildings, their weapons trained on Zara and her companions. And at their head, a figure in a hooded black robe. The figure reached up, pushing back its hood. Zara's heart stopped. It was Brian. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but it was him, alive.
Brian?
She whispered, her voice cracking. How? The weapon, Brian said, his voice flat and emotionless. Give it to me. Tyro stepped forward, his claws flexing. We destroyed it, Brian, don't you remember? Brian shook his head, his expression blank. No, the weapon is the key to stopping the Ascended. I must have it. Give it to me now. Zara's mind raced. Something was wrong. This wasn't the Brian she knew, the Brian she loved. He was acting like a stranger, like he was being controlled. Tyro snarled, raising his blaster. I don't know what game you're playing, but you're not Brian. Not anymore. Brian's soldiers tensed, their fingers tightening on their triggers. Zara's heart pounded. They were outnumbered, outgunned. If it came to a fight. Suddenly, a high-pitched shriek filled the air. Zara looked up, her eyes widening. A swarm of Ascended drones was descending on the city, their metal bodies glinting in the sun. The drones opened fire, energy blasts sizzling through the air. Brian's soldiers scattered, returning fire. In the chaos, Zara grabbed Tyro and Lex, dragging them into the cover of a nearby building. The Ascended! Lex panted, clutching his injured side. They must have followed us. Zara's mind raced. The Ascended had known they were coming. Had they sent the message, lured them here? But why? Her gaze fell on Brian, who was standing motionless amidst the battle, his eyes blank. And suddenly, it all clicked into place. They're controlling him, she said, her voice shaking. The Ascended. They must have implanted him with some kind of neural link, like they did with their ships. Tyro cursed, firing off a shot that took down a drone. Can we break their hold on him? Zara's eyes darted around the city, searching for... There, rising from the center of the city, was a towering spire, its surface covered in glowing, pulsing conduits, just like the ones they'd seen on the Ascended ships. That tower, she said, pointing. It must be some kind of control hub. If I can get inside, I might be able to use it to sever Brian's link to the Ascended. Tyro nodded grimly. Then go, we'll cover you. Zara took off running, weaving through the battle-torn streets. Behind her, she heard the sizzle of blaster fire, the shrieks of dying drones. She reached the base of the tower, her heart pounding. The door was sealed, its control panel dark. She pried open the panel, her fingers flying over the alien circuitry. The door hissed open. Zara darted inside, racing up the winding stairs. She burst into the control room at the top, her eyes widening. The room was a maze of pulsing conduits and glowing screens, all centering on a tall, crystalline column. And standing before the column, his back to her, was Brian. Brian, she called, her voice shaking. Brian, please. This isn't you. The Ascended. They're controlling you. You have to fight it. Brian turned slowly, his eyes blank. In his hand, he held a long, jagged shard of metal, its edges glinting. The weapon must be found, he said, his voice flat. The Ascended demand it. He lunged at her, the shard slashing through the air. Zara ducked, the blade missing her by inches. She dove for the control column, her hands scrabbling over the alien controls. Brian grabbed her from behind, the shard pressing against her throat. Zara struggled, gasping. Brian, please, she choked out. Remember who you are. Remember us. I love you. For a moment, Brian's grip loosened. Zara saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a glimmer of the man she knew. It was all she needed. She slammed her elbow into his gut, breaking free. She lunged for the control column, her hand finding a large, pulsing button. She pressed it. The room shook, the column flaring with blinding light. Brian screamed, clutching his head. The shard fell from his grip, clattering to the floor. And then it was over. The light faded, the room falling silent. Brian slumped to the ground, his eyes fluttering. Zara rushed to him, gathering him into her arms. Brian, can you hear me? Slowly, Brian's eyes opened. They were clear, focused, filled with recognition, with love. Zara, he murmured, his voice hoarse. What What happened? I remember the Icarus, the explosion. Zara held him tight, tears streaming down her face. It's okay. You're okay. The Ascended, they were controlling you. But it's over now. You're free. Brian clung to her, his body shaking with sobs. Zara held him, murmuring soft words of comfort. Outside, the battle had fallen silent. Tyro and Lex stumbled into the control room, their armor scorched and dented. They stopped short at the sight of Brian, their eyes wide. He's back, Zara said, smiling through her tears. He's himself again. As they helped Brian to his feet, Zara looked around the control room at the alien technology surrounding them. Technology that held the secrets of the Ascended, the key to stopping them once and for all. This city, she said, her voice filled with determination. It's more than just a ruin. It's a weapon, a tool we can use against the Ascended. Brian nodded, his jaw set. Then let's get to work. We've got a galaxy to save. And as they set out to explore the secrets of the ancient city, Zara felt a new hope burning in her heart. They had lost so much, suffered so much, but they were still standing, still fighting. And with Brian at their side once more, she knew that nothing, not even the might of the Ascended, could stop them now. Brian lay on a cot in the freighter's cramped medbay, his mind reeling from the flood of memories that had returned to him. Zara sat at his bedside, her hand resting gently on his arm, as Tyro and Lex looked on with concern. I remember, Brian said, his voice hoarse. The Ascended, they have a hidden base in the Corkson asteroid field. They're gathering an armada of ancient ships, preparing for an all-out assault on the galaxy. Tyro's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. If we could infiltrate that base, gather intel on their plans. Brian nodded, sitting up with a groan. We have to try. We can't let them catch us off guard again. They gathered in the freighter's cramped common room, poring over star charts and sensor data. The Corkson field was a treacherous expanse of tumbling rocks and gravitational anomalies, the perfect hiding spot for a secret base. The base will be well defended, Lex said, zooming in on a particularly dense cluster of asteroids, shielded no doubt and swarming with drones. Brian leaned forward, tapping the display. I have an idea. Those shields will have to have emitters. If we can take those out, we might be able to slip a small team inside. Tyro nodded. A sound plan. Lex and I can engage the drones, draw their fire. You and Zara can use that cloaked shuttle we salvaged to get in close. Disable the emitters. It was a risky gambit, but they all knew the stakes. They loaded up, checking weapons and gear, and set out for the Corkson field. As they approached the field, the freighter's sensors lit up with warnings. A vast swarm of Ascended drones encircled the base, a deadly halo of metal and energy. And there, shimmering faintly against the void, was the telltale distortion of an energy shield. Brian and Zara boarded the cloaked shuttle, while Tyro and Lex prepped a pair of agile fighters. As the freighter dropped out of warp at the edge of the field, the fighters streaked ahead, afterburners blazing. The drones reacted instantly, peeling away from the base to engage the intruders. Tyro and Lex wove through the asteroid field, thrusters flaring as they dodged and spun. Plasma bursts sizzled past them, shattering ancient rock. Meanwhile, Brian piloted the cloaked shuttle through the chaos, Zara monitoring the sensors. They darted from asteroid to asteroid, using the tumbling rocks as cover. The base loomed ahead, a vast, ominous structure embedded in the heart of a massive asteroid. They spotted the shield emitters, glowing nodes studding the base's surface. Brian brought the shuttle in close, hovering just above the rocky surface. Zara's fingers danced across the console, routing power to the shuttle's cutting laser. A lance of focused light stabbed out, etching a molten line across the emitter's surface. It flickered, sparks shooting from ruptured conduits. Brian moved to the next one, and the next, Zara slicing through them methodically. With a final flare, the shield collapsed, the shimmering barrier fading away. Brian gunned the engines, diving for a hangar bay that yawned open in the base's pitted surface. They set down amid a clutter of machinery and supply crates, the shuttle's cloak shimmering away. They crept through the base's corridors, blasters at the ready. The air was stale and cold, filled with the hum of ancient machinery. They passed vast chambers filled with assembly lines and research stations where ascended drones toiled over fragments of ancient technology. As they approached a particularly large chamber, they heard voices. They crouched behind a bulkhead, listening intently. "Progress on Project Genesis is proceeding as planned," a cold, metallic voice said. "The artifacts are responding well to the calibrations." "Excellent," another voice responded, this one deep and resonant. "Once the array is complete, we will be able to reshape the very fabric of the galaxy. The younger races will have no choice but to submit to our rule." Brian and Zara traded grim looks. Whatever this Project Genesis was, it sounded like the key to the Ascended's plans. They had to find out more. They crept deeper into the base, following the flow of power conduits towards the heart of the facility. But as they rounded a corner, they found their path blocked by a squad of towering figures. They were humanoid, but taller and bulkier than any human or Barzan. Their skin was a mottled gray, shot through with glowing circuitry. Their eyes blazed with cold, artificial light. Ascended super soldiers. The soldiers moved with blinding speed, lunging towards Brian and Zara. Brian fired his blaster, the bolts sizzling against the soldiers' energy shielding. Zara leapt to the side, her own weapon spitting plasma. But the soldiers were too fast, too strong. One of them backhanded Brian across the room, sending him crashing into a bulkhead. Another grabbed Zara by the throat, hoisting her off her feet. Brian struggled to his knees, his vision swimming. He saw Zara kick and struggle in the soldier's grip, her face turning purple. Desperation surged through him, and he raised his blaster, firing point blank into the soldier's head. The soldier staggered, its shield flickering. Brian fired again and again, until the shield shattered and the soldier crumpled, a smoking hole in its skull. Zara dropped to the floor, gasping for breath. But there were more soldiers, closing in from all sides. Brian and Zara fought with every ounce of skill and determination they had, blasters flaring, fists and feet flying. But it wasn't enough. They were going to be overwhelmed. Suddenly, a hail of plasma bolts stitched across the soldiers from behind. They turned, and there were Tyro and Lex, weapons blazing. They had fought their way through the drone swarm, battling through the base to reach their friends. Together, the four of them laid waste to the super soldiers. Plasma scorched the air, metal rent and tore. In minutes, it was over, the soldiers reduced to smoldering scrap. Brian hacked into a nearby console, his fingers flying over the keys. He downloaded everything he could find on Project Genesis, the data scrolling across his display. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Ascended were constructing a massive array of ancient artifacts, a machine that could alter the very fabric of reality. With it, they could reshape the galaxy to their whim, erasing entire civilizations, rewriting history itself. They had to stop it, had to find a way to destroy the array before it was completed. Brian copied the data, and they raced back to the shuttle. They blasted out of the hangar, alarms wailing behind them. But as they tore away from the base, a fleet of Ascended ships dropped out of hyperspace, weapons charging. Brian wrenched the controls, sending the shuttle hurtling towards a nearby nebula. The Ascended ships pursued, plasma blasts sizzling past the shuttle's hull. They plunged into the nebula, the ionized gas swirling around them. The sensors flickered and died, the nebula's energy disrupting the Ascended's tracking systems. Brian flew blind, navigating by instinct and memory. Behind them, the Ascended ships blundered through the gas, colliding with each other in their confusion. Explosions bloomed in the shuttle's wake, the ships tearing themselves apart. And then they were clear, the nebula receding behind them. The Ascended ships were gone, scattered and disoriented. Brian let out a shaky breath, setting course for deep space. In the shuttle's cramped confines, the group pored over the data they had stolen. The scope of the Ascended's plan was staggering, the implications terrifying. With the power of the array, they could remake the galaxy in their image, enslaving or exterminating any who opposed them. It was a threat beyond anything they had faced before. But as Brian looked around at his companions, at the determination in their eyes, he felt a flicker of hope. They had come this far, against impossible odds. Together, they would find a way to stop the Ascended, to save the galaxy from their ancient, implacable evil, no matter the cost. Zara's fingers flew over the console, her eyes darting across the screen as she analyzed the data from the Ascended base. Her brow furrowed as she pieced together the fragments of information, a sinking feeling growing in her gut. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's worse than we thought." Brian leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "Project Genesis," Zara said, her voice tight. "It's a plan to create a massive, interdimensional portal. If they succeed, the Ascended will be able to bring their entire civilization into our galaxy. We'll be overrun in a matter of days." Lex cursed under his breath. "How do we stop them?" Zara shook her head. "The portal requires an immense amount of energy to open. They need a substance called omnium, which can only be found in the core of a dying star." Brian's jaw tightened. "Then that's where we're going. We have to stop them from getting that omnium." They raced to the Vega system, where a massive star was on the verge of going supernova. As they dropped out of hyperspace, they found themselves in the middle of a raging battle. The forces of the Galactic Alliance clashed with the Ascended fleet, energy weapons flashing across the void. Brian gripped the controls, his eyes hard. "Looks like the Alliance got wind of the Ascended's plan. We've got to help them." The crew leapt into action, their ship darting through the chaos of the battle. Tyro manned the weapons, his claws dancing over the controls as he targeted the Ascended ships. Lex worked furiously to boost their shields, rerouting power from every available system. Brian piloted them through the heart of the battle, his jaw set. He had spent years running from his past, trying to forget the horrors of war. But now, with the fate of the galaxy at stake, he knew he had to fight. And fight he did. With daring maneuvers and clever tactics, Brian led the crew to victory after victory. They took out Ascended ships left and right, their knowledge of the enemy's technology giving them a crucial edge. But the Ascended were relentless. For every ship they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. Brian knew they were running out of time. If they didn't stop the Ascended from getting the omnium, all would be lost. "There," Zara said, pointing to a massive ship at the center of the Ascended fleet. "That's their flagship. If we can take it out, we might be able to buy the Alliance sometime." Brian nodded grimly. "Then that's where I'm going, alone." Tyro started to protest, but Brian cut him off. "No, I need you all here, protecting the fleet. I'll infiltrate the flagship and find a way to stop them." He suited up, checking his weapons and gear. As he prepared to leave, Zara caught his arm. "Brian, He smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know. Me too." With that, he leapt into the airlock and launched himself towards the Ascended flagship. He landed on the hull, his mag boots locking onto the metal surface. With a deep breath, he cut his way inside. The interior of the ship was a nightmare of twisting corridors and pulsing energy. Brian fought his way through, his blaster spitting fire as he cut down Ascended soldiers left and right. Finally, he reached the ship's command center, and there, waiting for him, was the Overseer. The being was a swirling mass of energy, its form shifting and pulsing like a living star. "Brian Drake," the Overseer said, its voice echoing in Brian's mind. "The last of the human warriors. How fitting that you should be here, at the end." Brian raised his blaster, his eyes hard. "It's not the end. Not if I have anything to say about it." The Overseer laughed, a sound like the cracking of a glacier. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, human. The technology you seek to destroy was created by your own ancestors. You are the rightful heirs to its power." Brian hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. "What are you talking about?" "Thousands of years ago, humanity ruled the stars," the Overseer said. "They created wonders beyond imagining, technologies that could reshape the very fabric of the universe. But they grew arrogant, and in their hubris, They destroyed themselves. The Overseer drifted closer, its energy crackling against Brian's skin. We, the Ascended, are the last remnants of that once great civilization. We have spent millennia trying to reclaim what was lost, to rebuild what was destroyed. Brian shook his head, his resolve hardening. And you'll destroy the galaxy in the process. I can't let that happen. He fired, his blaster bolts sizzling through the Overseer's form. The being roared in pain and rage, lashing out with tendrils of pure energy. Brian ducked and rolled, firing again and again. The battle was fierce, the very air around them crackling with power. But in the end, Brian stood victorious, the Overseer's form dissipating into nothingness. He raced back to his ship, his mind reeling with the Overseer's revelations. The ancient technology, the legacy of humanity. It changed everything. As he docked with the ship, Zara and the others rushed to meet him. "Brian, what happened? Did you stop them?" Brian shook his head, his expression grim. "I defeated the Overseer, but it's not over. We have a decision to make." He told them what the Overseer had said about the origins of the ancient technology. They listened in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "So what do we do?" Lex asked, his voice hushed. "Do we use the technology to stop the Ascended, even if it means unleashing its power on the galaxy?" Brian hesitated, torn. On one hand, the technology was their best chance of stopping the Ascended. But on the other, using it could have devastating consequences, just as it had for their ancestors. He looked out the viewport, at the raging battle and the dying star beyond. The supernova was approaching fast, its light growing brighter with each passing second. They were running out of time. Brian turned to his crew, his eyes hard with determination. "We have to find another way. We can't rely on the technology of the past to save our future. We have to forge our own path, find our own solution." Zara nodded, her hand slipping into his. Together. As the battle raged around them and the supernova loomed ever closer, Brian and his crew set to work, their minds racing as they sought a way to stop the Ascended and save the galaxy. The stakes had never been higher, the odds never more daunting. But they had each other, and they had hope, and in the end, that might just be enough. With the Overseer's defeat still fresh in their minds, Brian and his crew wasted no time in seizing the opportunity to strike at the heart of the Ascended's plans. They knew that every second counted as they raced towards the dying star, where the Ascended were harvesting the precious omnium. Zara's fingers flew over the controls of the specially designed probe, her brow furrowed in concentration. The probe, a marvel of engineering, was their key to navigating the star's treacherous interior. Brian and Tyro stood behind her, their faces grim as they watched the probe's telemetry on the view screen. The probe plunged into the star's roiling surface, immediately buffeted by the incredible heat and gravitational forces. Zara gritted her teeth, making constant adjustments to keep the probe on course. The star's plasma lashed at the probe's shields, threatening to overwhelm them at any moment. As they dove deeper, the probe's sensors suddenly lit up with a flurry of activity. Brian leaned forward, his eyes widening. "There, the core. Look at all those ships." The view screen revealed a staggering sight. Dozens of Ascended ships, their angular hulls silhouetted against the star's blinding light, siphoning streams of glowing omnium from the core. It was a massive mining operation, the likes of which none of them had ever seen. Brian and Tyro exchanged a determined look. They knew what they had to do. Suiting up in heavily shielded exo-armor, they prepared to board the mining ships and plant the explosives that would cripple the Ascended's operation. As they made their approach, the Ascended ships began to take notice. Alarms blared across the comm channels as the mining ships turned to face the intruders. Brian and Tyro jetted through the star's turbulent layers, dodging streams of plasma and energy bolts from the Ascended's weapons. They landed on the hull of the nearest mining ship, mag boots clanking against the scorched metal. Drawing their weapons, they cut their way inside, breaching the airlock in a hail of sparks and smoke. Inside, they were immediately met with a hail of razor shards as Ascended guards opened fire. Brian and Tyro dove for cover, returning fire with their pulse rifles. The mining ship's interior was a maze of narrow corridors and humming machinery, the walls pulsing with the eerie glow of omnium. They fought their way towards the ship's reactor, planting explosive charges as they went. The Ascended guards were relentless, their cybernetically enhanced reflexes making them deadly opponents. But Brian and Tyro were a well-oiled machine, covering each other's backs and pushing forward with grim determination. Meanwhile, back on the ship, Zara and Lex worked furiously to hack into the Ascended's communication network. Lex's fingers danced across the console, his forehead beaded with sweat as he battled the Ascended's formidable security systems. "I'm in," he crowed triumphantly. "Uploading the virus now. This should scramble their coordination and buy the others some time." As the virus propagated through the Ascended's network, the mining ships began to falter. Explosions bloomed across their hulls as Brian and Tyro's charges detonated, tearing through critical systems. The omnium stream sputtered and died as the ships lost power, drifting aimlessly in the star's turbulent grip. But their victory was short-lived. The star's core, destabilized by the Ascended's mining, began to convulse with increasing violence. Solar flares erupted from its surface, lashing out with searing tendrils of plasma. Brian and Tyro raced back towards their extraction point, dodging collapsing bulkheads and gouts of flame. The mining ship shuddered around them, its hull groaning under the star's immense gravitational stresses. As they reached the airlock, they skidded to a halt. Standing before them, blocking their path, was a towering figure clad in heavy black armor. The Enforcer, the Ascended's ultimate warrior, regarded them with glowing, cybernetic eyes. "You have interfered with our plans for the last time," the Enforcer rumbled, his voice a grating, metallic growl. "Now, you will die." He lunged forward, his movements a blur of speed and power. Brian met him head-on, his exo-armor whining with the strain as they clashed. They traded blows, the Enforcer's augmented strength matched by Brian's skill and determination. Tyro circled around, looking for an opening. He fired his pulse rifle, the bolts sizzling against the Enforcer's armor. The Enforcer barely seemed to notice, his attention fixated on Brian. Brian ducked and weaved, his mind racing as he sought a weakness in the Enforcer's defenses. He remembered his training, the countless hours spent honing his skills. He remembered the lessons learned from his time with the crew, the value of teamwork and trust. With a burst of speed, he feinted left, then spun right, catching the Enforcer off guard. His fist, enhanced by the exo-armor's power, smashed into the Enforcer's helmet, shattering the visor. The Enforcer staggered, his sensors reeling. Brian pressed his advantage, raining blows down on the Enforcer's head and torso. Tyro joined in, his claws raking across the Enforcer's back. Together they drove the Ascended warrior to his knees, his armor sparking and smoking. With a final desperate roar, the Enforcer lashed out, his fist connecting with Brian's chest plate. Brian flew back, crashing into the bulkhead, but the Enforcer's strength was spent. He slumped to the deck, his cybernetic implants flickering and dying. Brian and Tyro wasted no time. They leaped into the airlock, sealing it behind them just as the mining ship began to tear itself apart. They jetted away, the star's fury chasing at their heels. Zara brought the ship around, the airlock yawning open to receive them. They tumbled inside, gasping and exhausted. On the view screen, the star convulsed, its core collapsing in on itself. The Ascended ships, caught in the star's death throes, were consumed one by one, vanishing in blinding flashes of light. And then, with a final titanic explosion, the star went supernova. The shockwave slammed into their ship, sending them tumbling end over end. Alarms screamed, consoles sparked and smoked. But Zara held the ship steady, riding the wave of energy like a surfer on a monstrous breaker. Slowly, the chaos subsided. The ship righted itself, the star's remnants receding behind them. On the bridge, Brian and his crew looked at each other, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, but alive. They had done it. The Ascended's plans were in ruins, the omnium lost to the star's fury. In the aftermath of the battle, as the Galactic Alliance mopped up the remaining Ascended forces, Brian and his team found themselves hailed as heroes. Their names were spoken with reverence in every corner of the galaxy, their deeds the stuff of legend. But for Brian, the true victory was more personal. He had found a purpose, a family, in this unlikely crew of misfits and outcasts. Together they had faced the impossible and emerged triumphant. And yet, even as they basked in the glow of victory, Brian knew that their journey was far from over. The revelation of humanity's connection to the ancient technology weighed heavily on his mind, raising questions that demanded answers. What was their true legacy? What role had their ancestors played in the rise of the Ascended? And what did it mean for the future of the galaxy, now that this terrible power was once again in play? These were the questions that would drive Brian and his crew forward, into the unknown reaches of space and time. For in a galaxy forever changed by their actions, one thing remained certain. There would always be a need for heroes, for those willing to stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. And Brian knew, with a certainty that burned in his heart, that he and his crew would be there to answer that call, no matter where it might lead them. As the Icarus soared through the void towards Earth, Brian couldn't shake the unease that gripped him. The revelations about humanity's ancient past, the true nature of the technology they'd fought so hard to protect, weighed heavily on his mind. Zara placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle. "We did the right thing, Brian. The galaxy is safe, thanks to us." Brian nodded, but the doubts lingered. But at what cost? We've unleashed a power we barely understand, one that nearly destroyed our ancestors. What if we're just repeating their mistakes? Tyro growled, his mandibles clicking. "We'll be vigilant. We won't let history repeat itself." As Earth grew larger in the view screen, a message pinged on the comm. "Icarus, this is United Earth Command. Welcome home, heroes. The Council requests your presence at a ceremony in your honor." Brian frowned. "A ceremony? We don't have time for—" "They want to thank us," Lex interjected, grinning, "and maybe give us a medal or two. Come on, boss, we've earned a little celebration." Brian sighed, then nodded. "Fine, but let's keep it brief. We have work to do." They set the Icarus down at the United Earth spaceport, a gleaming sprawl of metal and glass. A cheering crowd greeted them, held back by lines of crisp uniformed security. Brian and his crew made their way through the throng, smiling and waving awkwardly. At the steps of the council chambers, a tall, silver-haired man in flowing robes greeted them. "Welcome, heroes of Earth. I am Chancellor Voss. Please follow me. The ceremony is about to begin." They entered the cavernous chamber, a soaring space of marble and steel. Dignitaries from across Earth and the allied worlds filled the seats, their faces beaming with gratitude. Brian and his crew took their places on the central dais, shifting uncomfortably in the spotlight. Chancellor Voss stepped to the podium, his voice booming. "Today, we honor these brave heroes who risked everything to save our galaxy from the threat of the Ascended. Their courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten." But as the Chancellor spoke, Brian's instincts screamed a warning. His hand dropped to his blaster, eyes scanning the crowd. A flash of movement, a glint of metal. Brian leapt forward, tackling the Chancellor to the ground as an energy bolt sizzled through the air where Voss had stood a heartbeat before. Chaos erupted. Dignitaries screamed and scrambled for cover as more bolts stitched the air. Brian rolled to his feet, blaster in hand, searching for the attackers. "There!" Tyro snarled, pointing. Black-clad figures were pouring into the chamber, weapons blazing. They wore masks emblazoned with a strange, swirling symbol. "Get the civilians out!" Brian roared to Zara and Lex. He and Tyro charged forward, their weapons spitting fire. They dove behind a flipped table, plasma scorching the air above their heads. "Who the hell are these guys?" Brian growled. "No clue," Tyro grunted, popping up to snap off a shot. "But they're well-trained. Military precision." Brian risked a glance. The attackers were moving with cold efficiency, cutting down security guards and corralling the dignitaries. "We have to stop them," Brian said. He vaulted over the table, Tyro at his side. They wove through the chaos, their blasters flashing. One of the attackers loomed up before Brian, a hulking brute with a cannon for an arm. Brian ducked under a sizzling bolt, then slammed his fist into the attacker's gut. The man doubled over, and Brian followed with a vicious uppercut that snapped the terrorist's head back. More attackers swarmed forward, their weapons chattering. Brian and Tyro fought like demons, a whirlwind of fists and feet and flashing blaster bolts. But there were too many. Brian felt a searing pain as a bolt grazed his shoulder. He stumbled, his blaster clattering from his grip. A hand seized him by the throat, hauling him up. Brian found himself staring into the cold, dead eyes of a mask. "Where is it?" the attacker hissed. "Where is the data on the ancient technology?" Brian spat blood. "Go to hell!" The terrorist raised his blaster, aiming point blank at Brian's face. But before he could pull the trigger, a bolt of plasma took him in the side of the head. He crumpled, and Brian fell to his knees. Tyro hauled him up. "You good?" Brian nodded, scooping up his blaster. "Let's finish this." They fought their way to the center of the chamber, where a tall, lean figure stood, watching the battle with cold amusement. Unlike the others, he wore no mask. His face was pale and angular, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "Ah, the heroes," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I am the prophet, and you have something that belongs to us." "The hell we do," Brian snarled. "Who are you? What do you want?" The prophet spread his arms, his robe billowing. "We are the Ascendant, the faithful servants of the ancient gods, and we will claim their power as our own." Brian raised his blaster. "Not a chance." The prophet laughed. "Oh, I think you'll change your mind." He raised a hand, and a hologram flickered to life. It showed a dozen glowing points of light, scattered across a map of the city. "Behold the cleansing fire. With a single command, I can reduce this city to ashes. Millions will die. Unless—" "Unless what?" Tyro growled. "Unless you give us the data on the ancient technology. Every scrap, every bite. Do that, and I'll spare this pitiful city." Brian's mind raced. He couldn't let this madman get his hands on that knowledge, but the lives of millions. He lowered his blaster. "Fine, you win. I'll give you the data. Just let these people go." The prophet smiled, cold and cruel. A wise choice. Brian reached slowly into his jacket, then lunged forward, a hidden blade flashing in his hand. The prophet dodged back, snarling. "Fool, you'll doom them all." Brian pressed the attack, the blade darting and slashing. The prophet was fast, inhumanly so, weaving away from Brian's strikes with preternatural grace. Around them, the battle raged on, Tyro and the security forces driving the terrorists back. But more kept pouring in, an endless tide of fanatical soldiers. Brian gritted his teeth, pouring all his skill, all his fury into the fight. The prophet was good, but Brian was better. He feinted left, then lunged right, his blade plunging into the prophet's chest. The terrorist leader staggered back, blood bubbling from his lips. But even as he fell, he laughed, a mad, gurgling sound. "You've changed nothing," he hissed. "The Ascendant will rise and the galaxy will burn." His hand fell open, revealing a small, pulsing device. Brian's eyes widened. "No!" He lunged for the device, but too late. The prophet's finger twitched, and the world went white. The explosions ripped through the city, searing fireballs that turned towers to ash and streets to molten glass. Screams echoed through the rubble as the blasts ripped through residential districts, through schools and hospitals and homes. In the council chambers, Brian staggered to his feet, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. Tyro lay nearby, groaning. The chamber was a ruin, bodies strewn among the rubble. "Zara?" Brian called, his voice raw. "Lex?" A cough, a shifting of debris. Lex emerged from behind a shattered pillar, helping a limping Zara. "We're here," Lex said grimly. "But the civilians—" Brian looked out over the burning city, his heart sinking. So many dead because of him, because he'd failed. We have to help, he said, his voice hardening. We have to save as many as we can. They stumbled out into the streets, joining the rescue efforts. For hours they dug through the rubble, pulling survivors from the wreckage, ferrying the wounded to makeshift triage centers. Brian worked until his hands bled, until his muscles screamed in agony. But he couldn't stop. He had to save them. He had to. In the end, they saved hundreds, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to the dead. The city was a charnel house, echoing with the wails of the bereaved. In the aftermath, as the fires cooled and the dead were tallied, the United Earth Council convened an emergency session, or what was left of it. Half the council had perished in the attack, and the rest were badly shaken. This was a declaration of war, Chancellor Voss said grimly. The old man had survived, but his face was lined with grief and exhaustion. By the Ascendant, against all humanity. The counselors murmured in agreement, their faces grim. Brian stood before them, his crew at his side, their expressions haggard. We'll stop them, Brian said, his voice hard. We'll find out who they are, where they come from, and we'll end them. Voss nodded. You will have the full support of Earth and her allies. But Brian, be careful. These Ascendant, they are no ordinary foe. Brian's jaw clenched. Neither are we. As they left the council chambers, Brian's mind raced. The Ascendant, the Prophet. They were fanatics, zealots obsessed with the power of the ancients, and they were willing to slaughter millions to get it. But why? What did they hope to gain? And how did they know about the ancient technology in the first place? Brian had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning, that the Ascendant were more than just a cult, more than just terrorists. They were a threat to the entire galaxy, and it was up to Brian and his crew to stop them. But as they walked through the ruined streets, past the weeping and the wounded, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were all out of their depth, that they were facing something beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to fight. He pushed the thought away. They had to try. They had to. For the sake of the galaxy, for the sake of all the innocents who had died today, they had to. Brian turned to his crew, his eyes hard. Let's get to work. In the aftermath of the attack on Earth, Brian and his crew delved into the origins of the Prophet's cult, sifting through the rubble of the shattered city for any clues. They pored over ancient texts and decoded cryptic messages, piecing together a trail that led them to the very edges of known space. The Icarus sliced through the void, its engines thrumming as it approached the uncharted planet. Brian stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the view screen. The planet loomed before them, a mottled orb of browns and grays. Scans show structures on the surface, Zara reported, her fingers dancing across the console. Massive ones, but no signs of life. Brian nodded, a sense of unease settling in his gut. Take us down. The ship descended through the atmosphere, buffeted by howling winds. As they broke through the cloud cover, the ruins of an ancient city stretched out before them, its towering spires and vast plazas crumbling with age. Brian's breath caught in his throat. The architecture was hauntingly familiar, echoing the designs they'd seen on the abandoned planet where the Ascended had once held him captive. They landed on the outskirts of the city, the ship's ramp lowering with a hiss. Brian led the way, his blaster at the ready. Tyro and Lex flanked him, their eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of threat. As they picked their way through the rubble-strewn streets, a flicker of movement caught Brian's eye. He spun, his blaster coming up. A bolt of plasma sizzled past his head. He dove for cover, shouting a warning. More bolts followed, stitching the ground around them. Ambush! Tyro roared, his own weapon blazing. Cultists poured from the ruins, their robes flapping, their weapons spitting fire. They were led by a tall, gaunt figure, his face hidden behind a golden mask. The Apostle. Welcome, Brian Drake, the Apostle called, his voice distorted by the mask. We've been expecting you. Brian gritted his teeth, popping up to snap off a shot. You know me? We know of you, the Apostle said. and of your quest for the truth about the ancient technology, a truth we have long sought ourselves. As the battle raged, the apostle spoke over the din, his voice carrying an eerie calm. He spoke of the cult's decades-long study of the ancient technology, of their efforts to unlock its secrets and harness its power. The prophet was merely a pawn, the apostle said, a tool to bring you to us. For the true purpose of the technology is not conquest, but ascension, to elevate humanity to a higher plane of existence. Brian ducked as a plasma bolt seared overhead, blasting a chunk out of the wall behind him. And you think you're worthy of this ascension? The apostle laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Worthiness is irrelevant. It is our destiny. And you, Brian Drake, shall be the key to unlocking it. The cultists pressed their attack, driving Brian and his team back into the ruins. Ancient defense systems whirred to life, energy barriers sparking into existence, automated turrets swiveling to track their movements. In the chaos, Zara was separated from the group, cut off by a wall of cultists. Brian saw her fall, a plasma bolt catching her in the side. He roared in anger, fighting to reach her, but the cultists drove him back. "Zara!" he shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. But she was gone, dragged away by the cultists as they fell back to their stronghold deeper in the ruins. Brian turned to Tyro, his eyes hard. "We have to get her back." Tyro nodded, his mandibles clicking in grim determination. "Then let's go hunting." They fought their way into the heart of the ruins, carving a path through the cultists' elite warriors. The stronghold loomed before them, a vast pyramidal structure that pulsed with ancient power. Inside, they battled through labyrinthine corridors and vaulted chambers, following the apostle's taunting voice. Finally, they burst into the central sanctum, a cavernous space dominated by a glowing, pulsing artifact. Zara lay at the base of the artifact, her blood pooling on the ancient stone. The apostle stood over her, his mask glinting in the eerie light. "You're too late," he said. "The ascension has already begun." Brian charged forward, a wordless roar tearing from his throat. He clashed with the apostle in a brutal hand-to-hand duel, their blows echoing through the chamber. As they fought, the apostle's mask was torn away, revealing a face twisted with madness and devotion. "You cannot stop this," he screamed. "The creators have ordained it." "The creators?" Brian snarled, blocking a vicious strike. "The ones who left this technology behind," the apostle said. "The ones who seeded the galaxy with the potential for ascension. They were not your ancestors, but a separate species, far older and wiser. They left their creations as a test, to determine who was worthy to join them in the higher realms." Brian's mind reeled with the revelation, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the fight, on saving Zara. With a final desperate effort, he drove his fist into the apostle's face, feeling bone crunch beneath his knuckles. The cultist leader crumpled, his life fading from his eyes. But it was too late. The sanctum shook, ancient energies tearing at its foundations. Brian gathered Zara in his arms, her blood soaking his shirt, and ran for the exit. They barely made it out before the stronghold collapsed, burying the artifact and the secrets of the long-dead creators beneath tons of rubble. As they limped back to the Icarus, Brian cradled Zara's broken form, his heart heavy with grief and questions. The cult had been defeated, but at what cost? And what of the creators, the ones who had set this all in motion? He looked out at the stars, at the vast, unexplored reaches of the galaxy. Out there, he knew, lay the answers they sought, the answers that would shape the future of humanity and of all the races that called the galaxy home. It would be a long journey, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But as Brian looked at his battered, weary crew, he knew one thing for certain. They would face it together, and they would not rest until the truth was uncovered, no matter where it led them. In the aftermath of the battle on the uncharted planet, the Icarus limped through the void, its hull scored with the scars of combat. In the medbay, Zara lay in a healing pod, her wounds slowly knitting under the gentle pulse of the medical lasers. Brian sat at her side, his eyes heavy with fatigue and worry. The revelations about the ancient technology weighed on him, the questions and uncertainties gnawing at his mind. A chime from his wristcom broke his reverie. He tapped the screen, his brow furrowing as an encrypted message scrolled across the display. "What is it?" Tyro asked, entering the medbay. Brian shook his head. "Coordinates and a warning. Someone claims they know the truth about the ancient tech." Tyro's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "A trap?" "Maybe, but we can't afford to ignore it." Brian stood, his jaw set with determination. "Assemble a team. We're going in." The Icarus dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system's asteroid belt. Ahead, hidden among the tumbling rocks, hung a massive space station, its hull shimmering with active camouflage. "Scans show advanced defenses," Zara said, her fingers dancing across the console. "And a fleet of armed ships patrolling the perimeter." Brian nodded grimly. "We'll need to sneak aboard. Tyro, you're with me. Zara, you're on hacking duty. Find us a way in." Zara's fingers flew over the keys, her face tight with concentration. "Got it. A stolen access code. It should get you past the outer defenses." Brian and Tyro suited up, checking their weapons and gear. With a final nod, they cycled through the airlock and launched towards the station. They drifted through the void, using the tumbling asteroids as cover. The station loomed ahead, a gleaming behemoth bristling with gun turrets and sensor arrays. They reached the outer hull, mag boots clanking against the metal. Brian punched in the stolen code, his breath fogging his helmet visor. The airlock hissed open, and they slipped inside. The station's interior was a maze of sleek corridors and humming machinery. Brian and Tyro crept forward, blasters at the ready. They passed labs filled with strange equipment, the screens flickering with arcane symbols and diagrams. "This is no ordinary research facility," Tyro murmured, his eyes narrowing. Brian nodded, a cold knot forming in his gut. Whatever this place was, it reeked of secrecy and danger. They delved deeper, following the trail of power conduits and data lines, and then they saw it, a vast chamber filled with rows of stasis pods, and within each pod, a twisted figure, half human, half machine. "By the gods," Tyro breathed. "What have they done?" Brian stepped closer, his heart pounding. The figures were grotesque parodies of life, their flesh fused with gleaming metal and pulsing circuitry, failed experiments, discarded like broken toys. And then he saw the plans, schematics for an army of cybernetic soldiers, their minds enslaved to a single will, the will of the Syndicate. Suddenly alarms blared throughout the facility, red lights flashed, and the thud of booted feet echoed through the corridors. "They know we're here," Brian snarled, raising his blaster. "We need to move." They ran, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. They burst into a hangar bay, filled with sleek, deadly fighters. And there, standing before them, a squad of Syndicate soldiers, their bodies bristling with cybernetic enhancements. Brian and Tyro opened fire, the air crackling with energy bolts. They dove for cover. The soldiers returned fire, sizzling overhead. The battle was fierce, a desperate dance of blades and blasters. Brian fought like a man possessed, his every move fueled by rage and desperation. These monsters had to be stopped, their twisted experiments ended. And then, as the last soldier fell, a slow clap echoed through the hangar. A tall, gaunt figure stepped from the shadows, his face a mask of cruel amusement. "Impressive," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "You fight well for a relic of a bygone age." Brian raised his blaster, his eyes hard. "Who are you?" The man smiled, a thin, razor-sharp thing. "I am the director, the visionary behind the Syndicate's great work. And you, Brian Drake, are a man out of time." He stepped closer, his cybernetic eyes gleaming. "The ancient technology is the key to the future, the key to ascending beyond the limits of flesh and blood. Join us, and you'll have power beyond your wildest dreams." Brian's finger tightened on the trigger. I've seen what you do with that power, the lives you destroy. I'll never join you. The director sighed, a sound of mock regret. A pity. You could have been a god. Now, you'll just be another failed experiment. He moved, a blur of speed and lethal grace. Brian fired, but the director was too fast, his body enhanced by the very technology he sought to control. They clashed in a whirlwind of strikes and counters, the director's blows fueled by cybernetic strength. Brian fought with all the skill and savagery he possessed, but it wasn't enough. A blow sent him crashing to the deck, his blaster skittering away. The director loomed over him, a cruel smile on his lips. Goodbye, Brian Drake. You had your chance for greatness, and you squandered it. He raised his fist, the metal knuckles gleaming. Brian braced for the end. And then Tyro was there, a roar of fury on his lips. He slammed into the director, the two of them tumbling across the deck. Brian staggered to his feet, scooping up his blaster. Together, they drove the director back, their blows fueled by desperation and raw, primal rage. The cybernetic enhancements were powerful, but they were no match for the indomitable will of the human spirit. In a final desperate move, Brian lunged forward, his blaster pressed to the director's temple. He pulled the trigger, and the director's head snapped back, a smoking hole in his forehead. The fight was over. The station shuddered around them, alarms wailing as the damage from the battle took its toll. Brian and Tyro raced for the Icarus, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame. They barely made it aboard before the station tore itself apart, vanishing in a blinding flash of light. In the aftermath, they sifted through the data they'd managed to salvage, the secrets of the syndicate laid bare. And there, buried in the files, a glimmer of hope. The coordinates for a long-lost alien world, where an artifact of immense power was said to rest. An artifact that could hold the key to unraveling the mysteries of the ancient technology, once and for all. Brian set the coordinates, his jaw tight with determination. They had a new mission now, a new purpose, to find the artifact and unlock the secrets of the past. Before the Syndicate or any other power could use that knowledge to enslave the galaxy. The Icarus shuddered as it plunged into the heart of the Zorgon Nebula, its sensors overwhelmed by the chaotic maelstrom of radiation and gravitational anomalies. Brian gripped the controls, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the ship steady. "Shields at 50%, Zara shouted over the blaring alarms. "The radiation is eating through our defenses." Brian gritted his teeth, sweat beading his brow. "Reroute power from the weapon systems. We have to hold together until—" The ship lurched violently as a barrage of plasma bolts slammed into its hull. Tyro, hunched over the tactical display, cursed. "Kralian ships, a whole damn fleet. They're boxing us in." On the view screen, a dozen angular, predatory vessels swarmed around the Icarus, their weapons blazing. At their center, a massive flagship loomed, its hull adorned with the sigil of a new Kralian warlord. Brian's mind raced, calculating odds and strategies. They were outgunned and outnumbered, caught in a deadly crossfire. But the nebula, treacherous as it was, could be their salvation. "Tyro, scan for pockets of intense radiation," he barked. "Zara, be ready to divert all power to the engines. We're going to play a little game of chicken." The Icarus wove through the nebula, its pursuers dogging its every turn. Plasma bolts and gravitational shears tore at its shields, threatening to rip the ship apart. But Brian flew like a man possessed, using every trick and maneuver he'd learned in his years on the edge of the law. Suddenly, Tyro's console pinged with an alert. "Got one! A radiation pocket dense enough to fry their systems." Brian nodded grimly. "Zara, now!" The Icarus surged forward, its engines screaming as it dove headlong into the seething pocket of energy. The Kralian ships, caught off guard, plunged in after them, their shields flickering and failing as the radiation bombarded their hulls. One by one, the Kralian ships fell away, their systems overloaded, their crews scrambling to escape the nebula's fury. But the flagship pressed on, its shields strained to the breaking point but holding. Brian's eyes narrowed. The warlord was tenacious, he'd give him that. But he'd picked the wrong fight. Prepare for boarding action, he said, his voice cold. We're taking this fight to their turf. The Icarus slammed into the flagship's hangar bay, its hull screeching against the deck plates. Brian and his team stormed out, weapons blazing, cutting through the Krallian defenders like a hot knife through butter. They fought their way to the bridge, a trail of broken bodies and shattered bulkheads in their wake. Brian kicked down the final door, his blaster leveled at the warlord's head. The Krallian leader stood tall and proud, his armor gleaming in the flickering light. "Brian Drake," he said, his voice a rumble of thunder. "I've heard much about you." Brian's finger tightened on the trigger. "Wish I could say the same. Who the hell are you?" The warlord chuckled, a sound like grinding metal. "I am Zoruk, the new master of the Krallian Empire, and you, human, have something I want." Brian's eyes narrowed. "Let me guess. The artifact." Zoruk nodded, his gaze cold and calculating. "My allies in the Syndicate have told me much about its power. With it, I could rule not just the Krallians, but the entire galaxy." Brian shook his head. "Not going to happen. That artifact is too dangerous for anyone to control." Zoruk's hand drifted to his blade, a cruel, serrated thing. "You would deny me my destiny. I offer you a choice, human. Give me the coordinates to the artifact, and I will spare your lives. Refuse, and I will take great pleasure in ending them." Brian's response was a blaster bolt, sizzling past Zoruk's head. The warlord roared, his blade leaping to his hand, and the battle was joined. They clashed across the bridge, blades sparking, fists and feet flying. Zoruk was a skilled warrior, his every move precise and deadly, but Brian fought with the desperate strength of a man with everything to lose. The tide turned back and forth, each combatant seeking an opening, a weakness to exploit. Brian felt his strength flagging, his wounds burning. Zoruk pressed his advantage, his blade slicing through Brian's defenses, drawing blood. But just as the warlord raised his sword for the killing blow, Zara leapt forward, her hands flying across a control panel. "Brian, get clear!" she shouted. Brian dove to the side as Zara slammed her hand down on a flashing red button. The ship bucked and heaved, alarms screaming as the reactor core began to overload. Zoruk roared in fury, lunging for Zara, but Brian was there, tackling the warlord, driving him back. They grappled, straining, as the bridge began to tear itself apart around them. With a final, desperate heave, Brian threw Zoruk off him, sending the warlord crashing through a bulkhead. He grabbed Zara, pulling her towards the exit. "Time to go!" They ran, the ship shuddering and convulsing around them. Bulkheads buckled, consoles exploded in showers of sparks. They barely made it to the Icarus before the flagship erupted, a miniature supernova that engulfed the remaining Krallian ships. Battered and bleeding, Brian and his crew limped away from the carnage, the coordinates to the artifact still safely in their possession. They delved deeper into the nebula, following the trail to a hidden planetoid, a world that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. As they approached, their sensors picked up a massive energy signature, a pulsing, otherworldly rhythm that set their teeth on edge. On the planet's surface, a colossal alien structure loomed, its spires and arches twisting in impossible geometries. "There it is," Zara breathed, her eyes wide. "The artifact." But as they prepared to make landfall, a new alert blared across their screens. A fleet of ships bearing the sigil of the Syndicate was closing fast, weapons hot and hungry. Brian's jaw clenched. The ruthless scientist from the research facility had found them, and he wouldn't stop until he had the artifact in his grasp. The race was on, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The Icarus shuddered as it plunged towards the alien planetoid, the Syndicate fleet hot on their heels. Brian gripped the controls, his jaw clenched as he guided the ship through the twisting gravitational anomalies that surrounded the strange, pulsing structure. "Hold on tight!" he shouted as the ship bucked and heaved. "We're going in hard and fast!" With a bone-jarring impact, the Icarus slammed into the planetoid's surface, skidding across the crystalline rock before coming to a rest in the shadow of a towering spire. Brian and his crew leapt from the ship, weapons at the ready, their eyes wide as they took in the alien landscape. Towering spires of shimmering crystal rose from the ground, pulsing with strange, otherworldly energy. Veins of glowing plasma snaked through the rock, casting an eerie light across the surreal terrain. It was like nothing they had ever seen before, a world that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. But there was no time to marvel at the strange beauty of the place. The coordinates from the Syndicate's research led them towards the heart of the structure, and they set off at a run, their boots crunching against the crystalline ground. Almost immediately, they were beset by the planetoid's defenses. Strange, robotic guardians emerged from the rock, their metal limbs whirring and clicking as they advanced on the intruders. Energy beams lanced out from hidden emplacements, searing the air and sending chips of crystal flying. Brian and his crew fought back with everything they had, their weapons blazing as they carved a path through the ancient machines. Tyro's claws ripped through metal and circuitry, while Zara's hacking skills proved invaluable in overriding the planetoid's defense systems. Deeper and deeper they delved, following the twisting tunnels and glowing conduits that led towards the heart of the structure. And then, with a final burst of speed, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. The chamber was filled with strange, alien machinery, pulsing with the same otherworldly energy that suffused the rest of the planetoid. Glowing pools of liquid energy cast a shimmering light across the room, and at the center, rising from a raised dais, stood a towering cylindrical device that seemed to hum with barely contained power. The artifact. The key to unlocking the secrets of the ancient technology. The thing they had risked everything to find. But as they approached the dais, a voice rang out across the chamber. "Stop right there!" Brian spun, his blaster coming up, and found himself face to face with the Syndicate scientist, flanked by a squad of heavily armed soldiers. The man's eyes were wild, his face twisted with obsession and madness. "The artifact is mine!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. "With its power, I will unlock the secrets of the universe. I will become a god." Brian's finger tightened on the trigger. Not if we have anything to say about it. And with that, the chamber erupted into chaos. The Syndicate soldiers opened fire, their weapons spitting plasma and laser bolts. Brian and Tyro leapt forward, engaging the enemy in a brutal close-quarters battle, while Zara and Lex raced towards the artifact, their fingers flying across the strange alien controls. The battle raged across the chamber, the air filled with the smell of ozone and burning metal. Brian fought like a man possessed, his blaster spitting fire as he cut down soldier after soldier. Beside him, Tyro was a whirlwind of claws and fury, his alien battle cry echoing off the walls. But the Syndicate forces were relentless, and for every soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. Brian felt his strength flagging, his muscles burning with fatigue. They couldn't keep this up forever. And then, just as all seemed lost, Zara let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it!" The artifact began to glow, a blinding otherworldly light that filled the chamber. Brian felt a strange, tingling sensation wash over his skin. And then, with a sudden, wrenching jolt, the entire world seemed to twist and distort around him. The Syndicate soldiers screamed as the energy field engulfed them, their bodies disintegrating into clouds of glowing ash. Brian and his crew clung to each other, barely able to hold on as the chamber shook and heaved around them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The energy field subsided, and Brian found himself standing in a strange, ethereal realm, a place that seemed to exist outside of time and space. Before him, hovering in the void, was a ghostly, alien figure, its form shimmering and indistinct. It spoke with a voice that echoed through Brian's mind, a voice that carried the weight of eons. "Greetings, Brian Drake," the figure said. "I am the last remnant of the civilization that created the technology you seek. I have waited long for one such as you to find me." The being spoke of the true history of the ancient civilization, of the great wonders they had created and the terrible price they had paid for their hubris. Brian listened, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was hearing. But before he could fully process the revelation, he felt a sudden, wrenching sensation, and found himself back in the physical world, standing once more in the underground chamber. The artifact lay in pieces at his feet, its power spent. The syndicate forces were gone, reduced to nothing more than piles of ash and twisted metal. And as Brian and his crew made their way back to the surface, they emerged into a galaxy that had been forever changed by the events of the past few hours. The syndicate fleet, caught in the energy field, had been completely destroyed, its ships reduced to drifting wreckage. The Kralians, sensing the shift in power, had fled back to their own space, their dreams of conquest shattered. A new era had begun, an era shaped by the secrets that Brian and his crew had uncovered. The knowledge of the ancient civilization, the true nature of the technology that had shaped the galaxy for eons. It was a heavy burden, a responsibility that weighed on Brian's shoulders like a physical thing. But as he looked around at his crew, at the determination and resolve in their eyes, he knew that they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would forge a new path for the galaxy, a path guided by the lessons of the past and the hope for a better future. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but they would face it as they always had. As a team, as friends, as the heroes the galaxy needed, now more than ever. Brian and his crew emerged from the Icarus onto the landing pad, blinking in the bright Earth sunlight. A swarm of reporters and government officials surged forward, shouting questions and demands. Brian held up a hand, his expression grim. "Please, we've been through a lot. We need time to debrief and recover." But there was no respite. The United Earth Council, hungry for answers, whisked them away to an underground bunker. For days they were subjected to endless interrogations, their every word picked apart and analyzed. Zara rubbed her temples, exhausted. "They're like vultures picking at the scraps of our story." Tyro growled, his claws flexing. "They fear what they do not understand. They seek to control the knowledge we bring." Brian paced the sterile room, his mind racing. He could see the factions forming within the council, each vying for power and influence. It was a political nightmare. A knock at the door startled them. A tall, slender man entered, his eyes glinting with intelligence. "Brian Drake, I'm Zeph. We need to talk." Brian frowned, his hand drifting to his blaster. "About what?" Zeph leaned forward, his voice low. "The artifact you found? It's just the beginning. There are others, scattered across the galaxy. Each one holds a piece of the puzzle." Brian's eyes widened. "The ancient technology." Zeph nodded. "My group has been studying it for decades in secret. We believe it holds the key to unlocking the true potential of the universe." Brian hesitated, torn. His loyalty to Earth ran deep, but the lure of the truth was stronger. "What do you propose?" Zeph smiled. "Join us. Help us find the other artifacts. Together, we can unravel the mysteries of the ancients and shape the future of the galaxy." Brian looked to his crew, seeing the determination in their eyes. They had come too far to turn back now. He turned to Zeph, his decision made. "We're in." They slipped away in the dead of night, the Icarus cutting through the stars like a blade. Zeph guided them to the edge of Kralian space, to a long-dead world where the ruins of an ancient civilization lay buried beneath the dust. But as they made landfall, they found they were not alone. Pirate ships swarmed the ruins, their hulls bristling with stolen tech. Brian cursed. "Looks like we've got competition." They infiltrated the pirate base, moving like ghosts through the shadows. The ruins were a maze of crumbling stone and twisted metal, the air thick with the hum of ancient power. Zara hacked the pirates' security systems, her fingers flying over the console. "I'm picking up a massive energy signature deep in the ruins." Brian nodded. "The artifact. Let's move." They fought their way deeper into the complex, blasters flaring, fists and feet flying. The pirates were ruthless, their weapons enhanced by the stolen technology. But Brian and his crew were relentless, their skills honed by a lifetime of battle. They cut through the pirates like a hot knife through butter. And then they saw it, the artifact pulsing with an eerie blue light. Brian reached for it, his heart pounding. A blast of energy sent him flying. He crashed to the ground, his vision swimming. A massive figure loomed over him, a cyborg with glowing red eyes. "You dare to challenge Raxor, thief?" Brian spat blood, his hand closing around his blaster. "I dare." They clashed in a whirlwind of blades and blaster bolts, their bodies enhanced by the energy of the ancients. Brian felt the power surging through him, his every blow fueled by the artifact's might. But Raxor was strong, his body a fusion of flesh and machine. He hammered at Brian's defenses, his blows shaking the very stones beneath their feet. In a final, desperate gambit, Brian lunged forward, his fist slamming into Raxor's chest. The cyborg staggered, sparks flying from his shattered implants. "You think you've won?" Raxor snarled, his voice glitching. "You're not the only one seeking the artifacts. There are others, far more powerful than you." Brian's blood ran cold. He snatched the artifact, his crew closing around him. As they blasted away from the ruins, the weight of Raxor's words hung heavy in the air. They had stumbled into a galaxy-wide race, with the fate of the universe hanging in the balance. Brian clutched the artifact, his jaw set with determination. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, they would see this through to the end. The future of everything depended on it. The distress call came as a piercing shriek through the Icarus's comms, shattering the weary silence that had settled over the ship. Brian jerked upright in his chair, his eyes snapping to the view screen. "What have we got?" he barked, his voice rough with fatigue. Zara's fingers flew over the console, her brow furrowed. "It's a Galactic Alliance research station in the Tau Ceti system. They're under attack." Brian frowned. They'd been chasing down leads on the ancient artifacts for weeks now, following the breadcrumbs left by Zeph and his mysterious benefactors. They were exhausted, stretched thin, but an Alliance station under fire. "Zeph," Brian said, keying in the secure channel. "You getting this?" The hacker's face flickered onto the screen, his eyes bright beneath his wild hair. "I am, and I think you need to check it out. That station, they were studying some kind of cosmic anomaly, could be connected to the artifacts." Brian's gut tightened. The artifacts, the ancient technology, it all seemed to be coming to a head, the threads converging into something he couldn't quite see, but he could feel it, like a storm on the horizon. "All right," he said, his jaw set. "Plot a course. Let's see what's out there." They dropped out of hyperspace into a maelstrom of destruction. The research station hung in the void, its hull breached and blackened, venting atmosphere and debris. Strange, ethereal energies crackled across its surface, casting an eerie glow. "Shit," Tyro growled, his claws flexing on the controls. "What the hell happened here?" Brian shook his head, his eyes scanning the wreckage. "Bring us in, carefully." They docked with the ruined station, the Icarus shuddering as it locked onto the twisted metal. Brian led the way, his blaster drawn, Tyro and Zara close behind. The station's corridors were a nightmare of shattered glass and sparking wires. Consoles flickered and died, emergency lights casting a hellish red glow. And everywhere, the signs of battle. Scorch marks, bloodstains, the twisted remains of bodies. They found her in the central lab, slumped against a shattered console. Dr. Kira Voss, her once white coat stained crimson, her face pale and drawn, but alive, somehow, stubbornly clinging to life. Brian knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Dr. Voss, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and shock. You're real? I thought I was hallucinating." "We're real," Brian said, his voice soft. "We're here to help. What happened here?" Voss coughed, a trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth. "They came through the anomaly, beings of pure energy, wielding technology like nothing I've ever seen. They called themselves the Void Walkers. Brian's blood ran cold. Void Walkers. The name seemed to echo in his mind, a half-remembered whisper from a dream. They were looking for something, Voss continued, her voice fading. Something ancient, powerful. They said it was theirs, that they had come to reclaim it. Her eyes widened suddenly, her hand clutching at Brian's arm. The artifacts, your artifacts. They're connected somehow. The anomaly, the Void Walkers. It's all part of something bigger. Something... A skittering sound in the shadows, a flicker of movement. Brian spun, his blaster rising. From the darkness, they emerged, tall, ethereal figures, their bodies wreathed in swirling energy. The Void Walkers. "Get back!" Brian shouted, shoving Voss behind him. Tyro and Zara fell into formation, weapons humming. The Void Walkers advanced, their movements fluid and unnatural. Energy crackled from their outstretched hands, sizzling through the air. Brian fired, the blaster bolt searing a hole through the lead walker's chest, but the being barely flinched, the wound sealing itself in a flare of light. They fought, blades and blaster bolts against lashing tendrils of energy. The artifacts at Brian's belt hummed and pulsed, resonating with the Void Walker's power. He felt it surging through him, a thrill of something ancient and vast. He embraced it, let it guide his movements, his shots becoming more precise, his reflexes faster. But the Void Walkers were relentless, their power seeming to grow with each passing moment. One of them lashed out, a tendril of energy coiling around Zara's leg, yanking her off her feet. She cried out, her blaster clattering away. Brian leapt forward, his blade flashing. He severed the tendril, the Void Walker howling in rage. But in that moment of distraction, another struck, a blast of energy catching him square in the chest. He flew backwards, crashing through a half-shattered bulkhead. His vision swam, his ears ringing. He struggled to rise, his limbs leaden. A shadow fell over him. A Void Walker loomed, its form flickering and shifting. It reached out, its hand brushing Brian's temple. And suddenly, he was no longer in the ruined station. He was somewhere else, someone else. A vast, alien city, its spires reaching to a sky of unfamiliar stars. And he was there, walking its streets, breathing its air. But not as Brian Drake, as someone else, someone ancient and powerful. The Void. Walker's voice echoed in his mind, a whisper that cut through the chaos of battle. You are one of us, Brian Drake, a child of the progenitors, the ones who came before. We have waited eons for your return. Brian shook his head, trying to clear the visions, the alien memories. I don't understand. Join us, the Void Walker pressed, its voice insistent. Embrace your destiny. Help us reclaim what is ours, and together we shall restore our civilization to its former glory. Refuse, and all you know will be lost to the void. Brian hesitated, torn. A part of him yearned to accept, to embrace this strange, ancient power that sang in his veins. But another part, the part that had fought and bled for the people of this galaxy, the part that had found family in Zara, in Tyro, in Lex, that part couldn't let go. He opened his mouth to respond, to tell the Void Walker that he would never abandon his friends, his cause. But before he could speak, a blast of plasma seared over his head, striking the Void Walker square in the face. The being reeled back, its form flickering. Brian turned, saw Tyro standing in the shattered bulkhead, his weapon raised, his face a mask of determination. The moment shattered, the visions faded. Brian was back in the ruined station, back in the chaos of battle. He surged to his feet, rejoining his team. They fought their way back to the Icarus, step by blood-bought step. But as they neared the airlock, a cry pierced the din. Dr. Voss, struggling to keep pace, stumbled. A Void Walker loomed over her, energy coalescing around its outstretched hand. Brian lunged, his fingers brushing Voss's lab coat, but too late. The blast struck her square in the back, hurling her broken body against the bulkhead. Brian roared in rage and grief, his blaster spitting a continuous stream of fire. The Voidwalker fell, its form dissolving into motes of light. They dragged Voss's body aboard the Icarus, even as more Voidwalkers surged towards them. The airlock slammed shut, the ship shuddering as Tyro wrenched it free of the station. In the silence that followed, Brian knelt beside Voss's still form, his head bowed. She had given her life to protect the knowledge she carried, the secrets of the anomaly and the Voidwalkers. Secrets that now lived on only in the data drive clutched in Brian's blood-stained hand and in the haunted depths of his own mind. As the Icarus tore away from the ruined station, the anomaly pulsing balefully in the view screen, Brian felt the weight of the Voidwalker's words settling on his shoulders. His destiny, intertwined with the fate of an ancient civilization. A choice between power and loyalty, between past and present. And the knowledge, cold and certain, that whatever path he chose, the galaxy would tremble in the aftermath. Brian rose, Dr. Voss's data drive gripped tight in his fist. He looked to his crew, to the grim determination in their eyes, and felt a flicker of hope amidst the despair. They had a new mission now, to unravel the secrets of the Voidwalkers and the anomaly, to understand the true nature of the ancient civilization and Brian's own role in its fate. A mission that would take them to the very edge of the known universe and beyond, into realms of mystery and danger beyond imagining. But they would face it as they always had. Together, a crew, a family, united by bonds forged in the fire of shared struggle and sacrifice. The Icarus plunged into the void, chasing the fading light of distant stars. And Brian Drake, last scion of a forgotten empire, led them forward into the unknown. The Icarus shook violently as it plunged into the heart of the cosmic anomaly, the distortions of space and time threatening to tear the ship apart. Zara's fingers flew over the control console, rerouting power to the stabilizers. Lex worked furiously beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration as he struggled to keep the engines from overloading. In the cockpit, Brian gripped the controls, his knuckles white. Tyro stood at his side, his claws digging into the armrests. The view screen was a kaleidoscope of swirling colors and twisted shapes, the fabric of reality warping around them. "Hold on!" Brian shouted over the blaring alarms. "Just a little longer!" Suddenly, the distortions vanished, and the Icarus emerged into a star system unlike any they had ever seen. At its center, a massive star pulsed with an eerie, sickly light, its surface roiling with dark sunspots and flares of energy. And orbiting the star, a colossal structure loomed, a ring-shaped device that dwarfed the Icarus, its surface etched with alien glyphs and pulsing with strange energies. "By the gods," Tyro breathed, his eyes wide. Zara's console pinged with an incoming transmission. Brian leaned forward, his brow furrowed. On screen. The view screen flickered, and a familiar face appeared, the Voidwalker who had spoken to Brian on the ruined research station. "Greetings, Brian Drake," the being said, its voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "I am Nexus. Welcome to the Ring of the Void." Brian's heart raced. "Why have you brought us here?" Nexus tilted its head, its eyes glowing with an inner light. "To meet with the leaders of the Voidwalkers, to learn the truth about the artifacts and the role you must play in the destiny of the galaxy." Brian glanced at his crew, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes, but he knew they had come too far to turn back now. "Very well," he said, his voice steady. "We accept your invitation." The Icarus docked with the ring, and Brian and his crew disembarked, their weapons at the ready. A delegation of Voidwalkers greeted them, their forms shimmering with an ethereal light. They were escorted through the ring's interior, a vast artificial world filled with towering spires of crystal and pulsing veins of energy. Strange devices and machines hummed and whirred, their purposes unknown. At the heart of the ring, they entered a massive chamber, its walls lined with glowing runes and pulsing conduits. And there, hovering above a raised dais, were the leaders of the Voidwalkers, a council of ancient ethereal beings that radiated an aura of immense power. "Welcome," Children of the younger races, the central figure spoke, its voice a whisper that seemed to fill the chamber. You stand in the presence of the last remnants of a once great civilization, the creators of the artifacts you seek. Brian stepped forward, his heart pounding. What happened to your civilization? Why were the artifacts scattered across the galaxy? The council member's eyes glowed with a deep sadness. Eons ago, our empire spanned the stars, a shining beacon of knowledge and progress. But we were struck down by a catastrophe beyond imagining, a cataclysm that fractured our reality and scattered our technology to the far reaches of space. Another council member spoke, its voice a soft hiss. We, the Void Walkers, are all that remain. For countless ages, we have worked to gather the artifacts, to restore our lost world and reclaim our destiny. Brian's mind raced with the implications. If the Void Walkers succeeded, if they unlocked the power of the artifacts. Suddenly the chamber shook with a massive explosion, alarms blared, and the Void Walkers let out cries of alarm. The ring is under attack, Nexus shouted, its form flickering. The United Earth Council has found us. Brian spun to face his crew, his expression grim. We need to get back to the ship now! They raced through the ring's corridors, the sounds of battle echoing around them. Council ships clashed with the sleek, deadly vessels of the United Earth Fleet, energy weapons flashing through the void. As they neared the docking bay, a squad of council soldiers blocked their path, their weapons trained on Brian and his crew. Halt! Their leader barked. By order of the council, you are to surrender the artifacts immediately. Brian's hand dropped to his blaster, his eyes narrowing. He glanced at his crew, saw the readiness in their stances. They had come too far to give up now. I don't think so, he growled, and then all hell broke loose. Blaster fire filled the corridor as Brian and his crew fought their way through the council soldiers, their skills honed by a lifetime of battle. They burst into the docking bay, the Icarus waiting for them like a beacon of hope. But as they raced towards the ship, a figure stepped out from behind a support pillar, Nexus, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Brian Drake, it said, its voice echoing in the chaos. You cannot escape your destiny. The artifacts, the ring, they are your birthright. Embrace your true nature and join us in reshaping the galaxy. Brian hesitated, the weight of Nexus's words settling on his shoulders. The truth of his identity, the role he was meant to play, it all hung in the balance. But then he looked at his crew, at the determination in their eyes, the bonds of loyalty and friendship that had carried them through so much. And he knew, with a certainty that burned in his heart, where his true destiny lay. I make my own fate, he said, his voice hard. And I choose to fight for what I believe in, not what some ancient council tells me to. Nexus's face twisted with rage, and it lashed out with a blast of energy that sent Brian flying. He crashed to the deck, his vision swimming. But his crew was there, fighting at his side. Tyro leapt at Nexus with a roar, his claws slashing. Zara and Lex laid down a blistering hail of cover fire, forcing the Void Walker back. Brian staggered to his feet, his blaster in hand. He charged at Nexus, firing as he ran. The Void Walker deflected the bolts with a shimmering shield of energy, but Brian didn't let up. With a final desperate lunge, he tackled Nexus, sending them both tumbling to the deck. They grappled, energy crackling around them, the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. But Brian was relentless, his every blow fueled by the strength of his convictions. With a final, brutal strike, he sent Nexus crashing into a support pillar, the Void Walker's form flickering and fading. Go! Brian shouted to his crew, stumbling towards the Icarus. We need to leave now! They raced aboard the ship, the docking clamps disengaging with a hiss of hydraulics. Brian threw himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls. The Icarus blasted away from the ring, weaving through the chaos of the battle. The council ships pursued, their weapons hammering at the ship's shields. But Brian flew like a man possessed, his every move guided by instinct and skill. They dodged and juked, the Icarus's engines screaming as they pushed them to the limit. And then they were clear, the ring receding behind them, the battle fading into the distance. Brian slumped back in his seat, his heart racing, his mind reeling with the revelations of the past few hours. The Void Walkers, the ancient civilization, the truth of his own identity. It was almost too much to process. But one thing was clear. The galaxy was on the brink of a war unlike any it had ever seen. A war that would reshape the very fabric of reality and determine the fate of every living being. And Brian Drake, the man who had started as a simple smuggler, now found himself at the center of it all. The weight of the galaxy on his shoulders, the destiny of billions in his hands. It was a burden he had never asked for, a responsibility he had never wanted. But as he looked out at the stars, at the vast expanse of the unknown that stretched before them, he knew one thing for certain. He would not rest until the truth was uncovered, until the galaxy was safe from the machinations of ancient powers and hidden agendas. No matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. For he was Brian Drake, the man who would change the course of history, and his journey was far from over. The Icarus tore through the void, the ring collapsing behind them in a blaze of light and energy. In the cockpit, Brian gripped the controls, his mind racing with the implications of what they had learned. The Void Walkers, the ancient civilization, the cataclysm that had shattered their reality. It was a puzzle that spanned eons, a mystery that could reshape the galaxy. And at its heart, the artifacts, the keys to unlocking a power beyond imagination, a technology that could bend the very fabric of space and time. Brian knew that the United Earth Council would stop at nothing to keep that power from falling into the wrong hands. And the Void Walkers, desperate to restore their lost world, would do anything to claim it for themselves. They were caught in the middle, a small crew of outcasts and misfits, thrust into a conflict that could determine the fate of billions. But they had faced impossible odds before, had stood against the darkness and emerged victorious. And they would do so again, no matter the cost. Brian turned to his crew, his eyes hard with determination. We need to find out more about this ancient civilization, about the cataclysm that destroyed them. If we can unravel the secrets of the past, maybe we can find a way to stop the war before it consumes the galaxy. Zara nodded, her fingers already dancing across the console. I'll start analyzing the data we gathered from the ring, see if I can find any clues. Lex grinned, his eyes gleaming with the promise of adventure. And I'll reach out to my contacts, see if anyone's heard whispers of other artifacts out there. If there are more keys to this puzzle, we need to find them before anyone else does. Tyro growled, his claws flexing. And what of the Council? And the Void Walkers? They will not rest until they have the artifacts, and us. Brian's jaw tightened. Then we'll just have to stay one step ahead of them. We've outrun the law and outfought the odds before. This is just another challenge, another obstacle to overcome. He looked out at the stars, at the vast expanse of the unknown that stretched before them. Somewhere out there, amidst the swirling nebulas and glittering constellations, lay the answers they sought. Answers that could change the course of history, that could shape the destiny of the galaxy for generations to come. And they would find them, no matter how long it took, no matter how far they had to go. For they were the crew of the Icarus, the last hope of a galaxy on the brink of war. And they would not fail, could not fail, for the sake of all they held dear, for the sake of the future itself. Brian's eyes gleamed with the fire of a man possessed, a man driven by a purpose greater than himself. He had started this journey as a smuggler, a rogue on the edges of society. But now he was something more. A leader, a warrior, a man with the fate of the galaxy resting on his shoulders. And he would bear that burden, would carry that weight, until the very end. For he was Brian Drake, the man who would change the course of history. And his legend was only just beginning. The Icarus tumbled through the void, its hull groaning under the strain of the cosmic maelstrom. Alarms blared as Brian and his crew fought to regain control, their faces taut with determination. "Shields are down to 20%. Zara shouted over the chaos, her fingers flying across the sparking console. "We can't take much more of this." Lex grunted as he rerouted power from the engines, sweat beading on his brow. "Just a little longer. I've almost got the stabilizers back online." Brian gripped the controls, his knuckles white as he struggled to keep the ship steady. The view screen was a kaleidoscope of swirling colors and twisted shapes, the fabric of reality warping around them. Suddenly, a familiar voice crackled over the comms. "Brian? Brian, can you hear me?" Brian's eyes widened. "Zeph, is that you?" The hacker's voice was strained, the connection tenuous. "Listen to me, there's no time. You need to set course for these coordinates now." A string of numbers flashed across the screen, a lifeline in the storm. Brian hesitated for only a moment before punching them in, his jaw set with determination. The Icarus shuddered as it tore through the anomaly, its engines screaming in protest. And then, with a final, bone-jarring lurch, they were through, the star system resolving around them. But what they saw made their blood run cold. The planet loomed before them, a roiling mass of storm-racked clouds and jagged obsidian peaks. Lightning forked across its surface, casting an eerie, pulsing glow. "What the hell is this place?" Tyro growled, his claws flexing on the armrests. Zeph's voice crackled over the comms once more. "It's the key, Brian, the key to unlocking the true power of the artifacts. You have to land, have to find the ruins." Brian glanced at his crew, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes. But he knew they had no choice. With a final, grim nod, he guided the Icarus down towards the planet's surface, the ship bucking and heaving as it plunged into the atmosphere. They set down on a rocky plateau, the ship's landing gear sinking into the obsidian sand. The wind howled around them, tugging at their clothes as they disembarked, weapons at the ready. "Stay close," Brian ordered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We don't know what we're walking into." They made their way across the barren landscape, the ruins looming ahead of them like the bones of some ancient, long-dead beast. Strange, alien glyphs were carved into the stone, their meanings lost to time. As they entered the ruins, Brian felt a strange sensation wash over him, a tingling at the base of his skull. He stumbled, his vision blurring, and then he was somewhere else. Someone else. He stood on a battlefield, the ground littered with the bodies of the fallen. Strange alien warriors clashed around him, their weapons flashing with otherworldly energy. He saw a figure at the center of the chaos, a being of pure light and power. It raised its hands, and the very fabric of reality began to twist and warp around it. And then the vision was gone, and he was back in the ruins, his crew staring at him with concern. "Brian?" Zara asked, her voice tight with worry. "What's wrong?" Brian shook his head, trying to clear the images from his mind. I saw the war that ended this civilization." As they delved deeper into the ruins, the visions came faster, more intense. Brian saw the civilization at its height, a shining beacon of knowledge and progress. He saw the enemy that sought to destroy them, a dark and terrible force that consumed all in its path. And he saw the cataclysm that ended it all, the event that shattered their reality and gave birth to the Void Walkers. With each step, Brian felt a growing sense of purpose, a certainty that he was being guided by an unseen hand. And then, as they entered a hidden chamber deep beneath the ruins, he saw it. The artifact was unlike anything they had ever seen, a pulsing, glowing orb that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. Brian approached it, his hand outstretched, and then... "Hello, Brian?" The voice was cold, familiar. Brian spun, his heart pounding in his chest. The Ascended Overseer stood before him, its form twisted and warped, a mockery of the being it had once been. It smiled, a cruel and terrible thing. "You've come far, child of Earth, but you do not understand the true power that lies before you." The Overseer gestured to the artifact, its eyes glinting with a mad, fervent light. "With this, we can reshape the galaxy, bring about a new era of ascended dominion. Join us, Brian. Embrace your true destiny. Brian hesitated, torn between his desire to protect the galaxy and the growing sense of connection he felt to the ancient civilization. He reached out, his fingers brushing the artifact's surface. And then he was falling, tumbling through a vortex of swirling energy. He saw the ancient civilization in its final days, saw the desperation and determination in their eyes as they fought against the darkness that threatened to consume them. And then he was face to face with the consciousness of the civilization itself, a being of pure light and energy. It spoke to him, its voice echoing through his mind. You have come far, child of Earth. But the true power of the artifacts lies not in conquest or domination, but in understanding and unity. The being showed him a vision of the future, a galaxy united in peace and cooperation. Species of all kinds working together, their differences celebrated rather than feared. This is the true legacy of our people, the gift we leave to the younger races. Take the artifact, Brian Drake, and use it to bring about this future. It is your destiny. With a gasp, Brian emerged from the vortex, the artifact clutched in his hand. He turned to his crew, his eyes shining with a new understanding. I've seen it, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. The true power of the artifacts, the future we can create. We have to bring this back to Earth, have to show them the way. The crew looked at each other, their faces a mix of hope and uncertainty. But as Brian spoke, his words painting a picture of a galaxy transformed, they felt a stirring in their hearts, a sense of purpose that had long been missing. Together, they made their way back to the Icarus, the artifact secured in the ship's hold. As they blasted away from the planet's surface, Brian felt a sense of peace wash over him, a certainty that they were on the right path. But little did they know that they were being watched, their every move tracked by a shadowy figure that lurked in the ruins below. The figure smiled, a cold and terrible thing. So it begins, it whispered, its voice echoing through the empty chambers. The final battle for the fate of the galaxy. And you, Brian Drake, will be at the center of it all. The Icarus tore through the void, its crew unaware of the storm that gathered on the horizon. The true test was still to come, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The Icarus descended through Earth's atmosphere, its hull still scarred from the battles it had endured. Brian stood on the bridge, the final artifact held tight in his hand. Zara and Lex were at his side, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. The ship set down on the landing pad of the United Earth Council's headquarters, a gleaming spire that rose above the city's skyline. A crowd had gathered, their cheers rising to a deafening roar as Brian and his crew emerged. Brian raised his hand, the artifact glinting in the sunlight. The crowd fell silent, their eyes wide with awe and wonder. People of Earth, Brian began, his voice carrying across the plaza. We have returned with a message of hope and unity. The artifacts we have gathered hold the key to a new future for our galaxy, one where all species can live together in peace and cooperation. He held out the artifact, its soft glow pulsing in his hand. This is the legacy of an ancient civilization, one that achieved wonders beyond our imagining. But they also learned the hard way the price of division and conflict. We must learn from their example and forge a new path forward. As Brian spoke, the council's leaders emerged from the building, their faces grim. They approached the crew, their eyes fixed on the artifact. Brian Drake, the lead counselor said, his voice cold. You have done a great service for Earth, but you must understand the gravity of what you propose. The knowledge and power represented by these artifacts could upset the balance of power in the galaxy. We cannot allow that to happen. Brian frowned, his grip tightening on the artifact. But don't you see? This is our chance to make a real difference, to bring an end to the cycle of war and destruction that has plagued our galaxy for so long. The counselor shook his head. I'm afraid it's not that simple. The other races will see this as a threat, a human bid for dominance. We must keep the artifacts secret, Use them to maintain our position of strength. As the debate raged on, Brian's crew shifted uneasily. Zara leaned in close, her voice low. Something's not right here, Brian. The council seems too eager to take the artifact, too willing to dismiss our vision. Suddenly, a blast of energy sizzled past Brian's ear. He spun, his hand dropping to his blaster. A group of heavily armed assailants had emerged from the crowd, their weapons trained on Brian and his crew. And at their head, a familiar figure in a dark cloak. "Zeph!" Brian growled, his eyes narrowing. "I should have known you'd show your face here." Zeph smiled, a cold and cruel thing. Brian, you didn't really think I was helping you out of the goodness of my heart, did you? The artifacts are the key to true power in this galaxy, and I intend to claim that power for myself." He gestured to his men, who began to advance on the crew. The Ascended were just the beginning. The true enemy has been waiting in the shadows for eons, and now, with the artifacts in our grasp, we will finally claim our rightful place as the masters of the galaxy. Brian and his crew leapt into action, their weapons flashing. The Council's security forces rushed to join the fray, but they were quickly overwhelmed by Zeph's superior numbers and firepower. In the chaos, Brian saw a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. He turned, his blaster leveled, and found himself face to face with the Kralian warlord, Zorok. But Zorok wasn't fighting against them. He was fighting with them, his massive blade cleaving through Zeph's men like a scythe through wheat. "I was wrong, human," Zorok growled as he fought. "I see now the wisdom of your words. If we are to survive, we must stand together against the darkness." Brian nodded, a grim smile on his face. Side by side, they fought their way through the streets of the city, the artifact clutched tight in Brian's hand. Zeph's men were relentless, their weapons fueled by a fanatical devotion to their dark master. But Brian and his allies were just as determined. They fought with the strength of those who knew they were fighting for something greater than themselves, for the very soul of the galaxy. In the heart of the city, they confronted Zeph himself, the dark figure wielding a crackling blade of pure energy. Brian leapt forward, his own blade flashing. They dueled across the rubble-strewn plaza, their blades clashing in showers of sparks. But even as Brian pressed his attack, he heard a cry of pain from behind him. He turned, his heart in his throat. Tyro lay on the ground, a gaping wound in his chest. Zeph stood over him, his blade raised for the killing blow. With a roar of fury, Brian leapt between them, his blade blocking Zeph's strike. He drove the dark figure back, his every blow fueled by rage and grief. In the end, it was Zorok who struck the final blow. The Kralian warlord charged forward, his blade cleaving through Zeph's defenses. The dark figure fell, his body shattering into motes of shadow. Brian rushed to Tyro's side, cradling the fallen warrior in his arms. Tyro's breathing was labored, his eyes glazed with pain. "You fought well, my friend," Tyro whispered. "But the battle is not yet over. You must continue the fight, for the sake of all we hold dear." Brian nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will, I promise." Tyro smiled, a final, peaceful expression. "Then I can rest, knowing that the future is in good hands." He closed his eyes, his last breath escaping in a gentle sigh. Brian held him close, his heart breaking. Around them, the city lay in ruins, the signs of the desperate battle everywhere. But even in the midst of the destruction, there was a sense of hope, a feeling that something had changed. Brian stood, the artifact still clutched in his hand. He looked out over the city, his eyes hard with determination. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The ancient enemy was still out there, waiting in the shadows. But Brian and his crew would be ready for them. For they had something worth fighting for, something more powerful than any artifact or ancient technology. They had each other, and the dream of a galaxy united in peace and understanding. And with that knowledge, that unshakable bond of friendship and purpose, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.